Okay, so I'm having a bowl of soup right now, and I'm about to start with this little series of Bitcoin videos on Khan Academy. I've used it before in the past, and I think I should definitely put my resources um towards the resources which I do have, which are not necessarily financial resources, but I have time and I have a functional brain. So maybe I can use those resources to maybe try to see about how I can earn financial resources for myself and free myself financially. And eventually, maybe that financial freedom will lead me to have more temporal freedom. So that will be awesome as well. And then with that free time, once I'm financially free, will will give me the opportunity to go meet some people from a more comfortable standpoint within my life where I'm not in a sort of situation of being lower than someone else. Um, from what I understand, basically, not to get too much off topic here, but that's kind of what the whole feminism movement is all about, right? They don't want to be from a lower perspective to men. So financially, as a man, I definitely don't want to be lower to anyone, whether it be another man or a woman. I just that whole situation is just not something that I seek out personally. So yeah. With that said, just want to make sure that I'm on page over here and that I'm using some of the commonly available resources and maybe do a little bit of further research on these different topics, kind of go within the rabbit holes of all these different topics that are potentially extremely beneficial, lucrative, and helpful to my existence as a human on this planet whilst I'm alive. So, these are things that might be extremely beneficial to me. And um, let's just put it this way, I definitely want to have children. I definitely want to have a female significant other. Marriage is still something that appeals to me, despite, I don't know, whatever might have made it unappealing. I don't know how it can become unappealing, but anyhow, just all those basic ideals of life and existence that I'm just trying to make sure I remain that adhere to in some sort of way. So yeah, without getting too much into theology and Christianhood or Judaism or whatever it is, Islamism, uh, Hinduism, I don't want to get into any of that. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm trying to make a video about Bitcoin, and here is the second video. So I did this one already. This is the what is Bitcoin, and maybe I'll just start over, right? Since I can't explain it, right? I can't explain it right now.
What
So
I
here,
want to
let
do
me
in this
just.
video is talk about what a Bitcoin is in general terms and what differentiating characteristics they have compared to other approaches. So for starters, Bitcoin is just an electronic payment system. And by electronic payment system, I mean it's just a vehicle, a conduit by which two parties can transact over the internet. I call these parties Alice and Bob. And let's say Alice, for whatever reason, wants to give money to Bob over the internet. And this may be because she owes Bob money, or maybe Bob is a merchant and Alice is buying something from Bob, or maybe Bob is a not for profit and Alice is making a donation to Bob. So there could be many reasons why Alice is trying to pay Bob over the internet in some capacity. Now, if Bob is willing to accept bitcoins, which are a form of electronic payments, then Alice can go ahead and send Bob some value in bitcoins. And really, a bitcoin transaction between Alice and Bob amounts to a specially constructed sequence of numbers that Alice will basically send over to Bob. And this will be done entirely over the internet. These numbers will have certain mathematical properties that make it hard for someone to really defraud the system or to conduct some type of nefarious action on the system. And the way that Alice is actually going to conduct this transaction in practice is either by installing a special piece of software, which we call a Bitcoin client, or she can work with a third party service that can handle these mechanics for her, but in either case, either the client or the service is going to generate these numbers for Alice.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pause
And
this
on
real
the flip
quick.
side, Bob will also
So right now they're talking about Alice and a transaction happening between Alice and Bob via an electronic payment, which would be with the Bitcoin. This video is apparently from when Bitcoins were worth $100. Pardon me for speaking with my mouth full. It's really cold. I even have a coat on and a scarf, and I'm having soup right now. So yeah, this is literally from 10 years ago. This is like 2012. Yeah, this is from the time that I was at Rutgers. And apparently some of the Bitcoins at the time were worth $100 or so, and now they're each worth about, like, was it 20k plus. So just to kind of explain like the whole dynamic of what I was doing, I'm not trying to like come up with an excuse for not having any Bitcoins or anything like that. It's just kind of like the priority at the time was me trying to get myself through university over, trying to invest in some other things. So that whole dynamic now is just, I can't go back in time and try to want to, invest in different things. So I can do that right now, and that's why I'm in what's it called, instructing myself on the matter, and hopefully I'll be able to, make money and not have some sort of imaginary employer that's like constantly trying to yell at me about everything. So the idea is that I would be able to do this on my own and learn how it works. I also was reading the Satoshi papers about Bitcoin, which is right here. I'm gonna try to bring it up. I'm not sure if it's showing or not on the screen. So yeah, see, I don't know what's happening here. It doesn't seem like there's a video actually occurring behind. So that is kind of confusing to me, to be quite honest. I'm going to try to check it out on a different platform just to see like what's actually happening here. Yeah, so that's what I thought. I must be doing something wrong. Okay, so soup's done. That's great. Yeah, so it seems as though. Yeah, so that's what I thought. I must be doing something wrong. So it would appear that I'm sharing a screenshot of the image versus a screen recording. So I have to try to remedy that and to see if I can do it properly. I don't know. I capture the fake. Did I capture video? No. So that's the one thing I don't understand. When I've done it in the past with a capture of the screen capture, when I've done that with the other ones, it totally records me moving different things, and yeah, that's why I don't understand like why.
Also typically either have a piece of software installed, or he'll use a third-party service that will take these numbers and allow him to
is it working
money
now?
to Bob over the payment system. And by electronic payment system, I mean it's just a vehicle, a conduit by which
I'm gonna double check once more.
parties can transact over the internet. I call these parties Alice and Bob, and let's say Alice, for whatever reason, wants to give money to Bob over the internet, and this may be because she owes Bob money, or maybe Bob is a merchant and Alice is buying something from Bob, or maybe Bob is a not-for-profit and Alice is making a donation.
I'm gonna double check
So there
once
could be
more.
many reasons why Alice is trying to pay Bob
over the internet in some capacity. Now, if Bob is willing to accept bitcoins, which are a form of electronic payments, then Alice can go ahead and send
yeah, sorry
Bob
if I do weird
some
face
value
movements
in
or anything like
bitcoins.
that.
And really,
I know it might
a
not. I'm
Bitcoin
still very
transaction
new
between Alice and Bob
to this whole
amounts
thing,
to
so I'm gonna
specially
have to try
constructed
to,
a sequence of numbers that
work
Alice will
at
basically
being
send over
better
to
with the
Bob.
camera. I'm
And
gonna rewind
this will be
this.
done
Sorry for
entirely over
speaking.
the internet. These
Well,
numbers will
I'm
have
not.
certain mathematical.
I'm not doing this for someone else right now. This is mostly for me, so it's kind of like a way for me to record me and what I was doing. And if what I was doing was, beneficial to myself, maybe it'll be beneficial to someone else. So I just don't really want to spend the whole video talking, especially while there's someone else speaking, which is the actual person. I'm probably going to put a link in the video, and the link is going to be of this exact page, and that way if somebody wants to use the resources that I'm currently using, it's not like a state secret or anything like that. This is just like common knowledge. It's on the internet and it's readily available for anyone to go see. So if you guys, whoever it may be, want to also find these same resources, I'll just put a link in the description. And feel free to go on Khan Academy and check it out. It's really nice. It's useful. I should probably use it more often. So before I play the video back, I'm just going to go downstairs and pick up the rest of the food that I had. And by the way, I hope everyone's having a good day. It just happens that I'm a little cold right now, but yeah. What I just said, essentially. Make sure you wash your hands just in case. I blew my nose recently, so. Take this away too. Yeah, and I'm wearing a coat inside. It's really cold. The goal is eventually of studying this right now is to eventually have more control over my time and my space. Clearly, also my finances, which are, despite my current appearance, were things that I definitely was very much so in charge of and had like a lot of control over. So, yeah, I think one of the main things was the source of where my funds was coming from. That's always been kind of the thing. Like in the past, it would have been like, how is Quentin able to pay for tuition on his own? Where does he get all that money from? How is he doing all these like simple questions like that? So I don't really want to dwell on it that much. But to answer the question, which I just referred to, was working in a restaurant many hours a week, and that's how I was making money. But in retrospect, if you observe really the skill set that's really available there for that specific job, it's just kind of standing up and cleaning tables and being quiet all the time. And just being able to observe what's present, and how people are moving and talking. But yeah, I mean, it's not what I went to school for. There are people who actually go to school to go study hotellery and all these different things. But like I said, I'm not trying to make a video about me talking. This video is about me learning this topic. So the faster I get to it, the more I can move on to something else, and maybe something else to learn. So productivity and control over time. All right, so I am back. I have some chicken nuggets. Didn't go crazy with the cooking today. Don't get me wrong though, I love cooking. But with that said, if this is like me saying, "Oh, I love cooking," there's a guy showing up like trying to get me in the kitchen, so I get yelled at all the time, but then get paid for it. I'm just going to respectfully decline that. So, yeah, let's do this. Bitcoin, what is it? Let's find out.
So for starters, Bitcoin is just an electronic payment system. And by electronic payment system, I mean it's just a vehicle, a conduit by which two parties can transact over the internet. I call these parties Alice and Bob. And let's say Alice, for whatever reason, wants to give money to Bob over the internet. And this may be because she owes Bob money, or maybe Bob is a merchant and Alice is buying something from Bob, or maybe Bob is a not-for-profit and Alice is making a donation to Bob. So there could be many reasons why Alice is trying to pay Bob over the internet in some capacity.
I'm going to pause the video once more here. I'm not going to pause much more often after this. What I'm just going to do real quick is I'm going to make sure that I have a page of pages open on the side. I'm monitoring the screen quite well. So I think I'm also gonna remove Stage Manager, just because I don't see the use of it right now. It's like really nice. It's like the part of the new update. It's really nice with some of the other content and everything. So it kind of like puts all this stuff away that wouldn't necessarily be needed. Oh look, this is literally about Bitcoin. This is a PDF called the Bitcoin Appear Electronic Cash System. So that's that right there. I'm gonna close that as well. Man, technically in the future I should totally be careful of having like a bunch of pages open and doing like a screening of my screen. I'm not like trying to hide anything per se, and this video I specifically put it to not be for children. But let's just say, you know, as an adult guy, if I, as an adult male, maybe there's some content that I just wouldn't want to be seen, you know, by others on YouTube. So, you know, if I have, not to mention, but if there's like Pornhub or something like that open, that I forgot was open, this would be like kind of funny, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to be in that situation. So, so dear YouTube, I hope you don't mind me. I'm not. I'm openly acknowledging the potential things that could occur during a live stream whilst live. It's kind of like the same kind of thing that happens on live TV, except this isn't television. So I'm just gonna make sure that I try not to encounter those kind of situations. Now, with that said, I'm going to try to open a page of pages and a brand new one. Let's see. Les fenêtres, options. And I'm going to make a new one. And while this video is playing, I'm just going to take like a little bit of notes on what I'm listening to, what I'm hearing. And that way, you know, there's that way the content that I'm consuming will actually be absorbed, instead of just like me looking at a screen and have my brain go numb for like the entire time, and then me not remembering a single thing that I was just watching or listening to. So instead, I'm going to do this. I'm also just going to double check real quick that the live stream is actually occurring properly. I noticed that initially the video was playing, but the screen was like frozen. So
For starters, Bitcoin is just an electronic
okay, so it's working.
payment
Awesome.
system. And by electronic payment system, I mean it's just a vehicle, a conduit by which two parties can transact over the internet. I call these parties Alice and Bob. And let's say Alice, for whatever reason, wants to give money to Bob over the internet. And this may be because she owes Bob money, or maybe Bob is a merchant and Alice is buying something from Bob, or maybe Bob is a not-for-profit and Alice is making a donation to Bob. So there could be many reasons why Alice is trying to pay Bob over the internet in some capacity. Now, if Bob is willing to accept Bitcoins, which are a form of electronic payments, then Alice can go ahead and send Bob some value in Bitcoins. And really, a Bitcoin transaction between Alice and Bob amounts to a specially constructed sequence of numbers that Alice will basically send over to Bob. And this will be done entirely over the internet. These numbers will have certain mathematical properties that make it hard for someone to really defraud the system or to conduct some type of nefarious action on the system. And the way that Alice is actually going to conduct this transaction in practice is either by installing a special piece of software, which we call a Bitcoin client, or she can work with a third-party service that can handle these mechanics for her. But in either case, either the client or the service is going to generate these numbers for Alice. And on the flip side, Bob will also typically either have a piece of software installed, or he'll use a third-party service that will take these numbers and allow him to do something else with those numbers. For example, Bob can in turn buy something of his own with those numbers, or he can trade those numbers in for real money, and so on and so forth. All right. Now, one of the first questions you might have, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is why would Bob even want to accept Bitcoins in the first place? After all, a Bitcoin is just a bunch of numbers. What intrinsic value would it conceivably have? And it turns out, quite surprisingly, that Bitcoins actually have real-world value. There are more and more merchants popping up each day who accept Bitcoins for transactions. There are also Bitcoin exchanges, places where you can go and exchange Bitcoins for more mainstream currencies. And some of these exchanges include, the major one is one called Mt. Gox. And at Mt. Gox, you can exchange a Bitcoin for a euro, a yen, a dollar, and so on and so forth. Now, the current price of a Bitcoin, the current value of a Bitcoin in US dollars as of this video is approximately 100 US dollars per Bitcoin. That number is fluctuating. This is the new currency, and there's going to be some...
So, just to keep in mind, this video, like I said, is from what I understand, is from about 10 years ago. I'm seeing like comments in here, which you guys can see too, from about 10 years ago, 9 years ago, 8 years ago, 5 years ago. And there's somebody who's saying, what is Bitcoin? Try to figure it out. The end result will be very few success stories and hundreds of thousands of losers. So, this is the kind of stuff that somebody here is from very recently watching this video in 2022 when he said $100 per Bitcoin. I laughed a bit, and then the other guy said, yep, he cried. Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely some comments that are from people who are watching this very recently, and kind of they literally commented on the very same thing. So I'm not going to get any further distracted. Someone had very similarly the same reaction that I had, and
fluctuation,
they
but as
commented
people
about it.
understand
Anyhow,
the currency better, the hope is that
Resume.
fluctuation will decrease. But I think ultimately the thing to keep in mind is that the value of a Bitcoin is going to be derived from the faith that you have in the value of what you can procure with that Bitcoin. It's just like you would for a dollar, a euro, or a yen. The faith that you have in that currency's value is how you value that currency. That Bitcoin. It's just like you would for a dollar, a euro, or a yen. The faith that you have in that currency's value is how you value that currency. Now, another question you might have is why do people even bother with Bitcoins in the first place? I mean, aren't there other more standard ways? Why couldn't Alice and Bob use PayPal? Why couldn't they use a credit card number to transact? Why couldn't Alice just send Bob an electronic check?
Hello?
Why not use one?
Hello? Yeah, somebody just called me and they said that it was potentially a scam.
Other approaches that are more
I don't
well
know.
understood,
Just
that are
gonna
more
pay attention to
mainstream,
this.
that are more established. Why on earth would you possibly want to mess with a good thing? So it turns out that there are a few properties of Bitcoins that are worth noting. And for starters, there's privacy. It turns out that within the Bitcoin ecosystem, within the Bitcoin network, people can transact without divulging who they are in the real world. From the perspective of Bitcoin, Alice's identity is going to be a sequence of numbers. And that sequence of numbers is effectively going to function like a pseudonym for Alice. And that sequence of numbers has nothing to do with her real world identity. Nobody needs to know this is Alice transacting. All they need to worry about is her pseudonym within the system. And this is kind of, but not quite, like what you would get if you bought something using cash. You know, in that capacity, when you buy something using cash, then you don't have to provide any details or proof regarding who you are in the real world. And that's different from, let's say, using a credit card, where you have to provide your name and your billing address and so on, or let's say providing an electronic check, where you need to tie that electronic check typically to your bank account details. Okay? Now, I do want to also mention here that sometimes when you have a cashless or a transaction that uses cash, there is now the possibility that people might try to use these transactions for malicious purposes to buy illicit goods and services. That definitely is a risk that occurs when you provide anonymity and privacy. But there are certainly legitimate reasons why somebody might want to conduct a transaction privately and not have the whole world know what they're transacting. Another property of Bitcoin is that it's open. Literally anyone can get involved. Literally anyone who has an internet connection can make a Bitcoin transaction. And all you need to do to get started, as I alluded to earlier, is download this special Bitcoin client. And the Bitcoin client, or for that matter, you can use a service like Mt. Gox, which will effectively do the same work as a client for you. But the short of it is that anyone who has a Bitcoin client or who has an account with an exchange like Mt. Gox can engage in Bitcoin transactions. That transaction, the details of it, the mechanics of it will be transparent to the user. All the user has to worry about, all Alice needs to worry about is how much money she has and whether she can give that money to Bob. The actual software underneath will take care of all the underlying mechanics of making that transaction work. Now, this is different. I mean, when you think about a traditional currency, like a dollar, if I want to transact something online, typically I need a bank account, I need a credit card, and so on and so forth. Then we often take it for granted that there are people out there who may not have access to a credit card, who may not have a bank account. For example, in the United States alone, it turns out, and I just looked this up, the number of households without a bank account, I read it, is somewhere north of about 8%. So it's pretty high. A lot of people out there who wouldn't be able to conduct a traditional internet transaction, but who can conduct a transaction using Bitcoin. And by the way, there are people using Bitcoin all over the world. I mean, literally, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. As long as you have an internet connection, you can start transacting Bitcoins. Now, another property of Bitcoin that's worth mentioning is that it's decentralized. There's no bank or centralized entity that can really control what's happening in the Bitcoin ecosystem. It's all done in this kind of ad hoc fashion. And what that means is that when you do a transaction, when Alice transacts with Bob over the internet, that transaction doesn't have to go through a third party. There's no bank that gets in the way of that transaction. And that can have certain benefits as well. For example, that means that no one entity can directly control the money supply of Bitcoins and so on. That also means that no one entity can, let's say, seize your assets, or for that matter, no one entity can reverse a transaction, which is definitely desirable for certain merchants. Some merchants might not be able to conduct business online because of fraud concerns. And if you have a system where the transactions cannot be charged back easily, then from the merchant's perspective, they may be able to inhibit fraud, and thereby that might enable their business entirely online. Now, I want to point out that this last property of decentralization definitely causes concern among some people around Bitcoin. After all, when you think about it, a central authority like a bank does perform an important function in the context of a traditional currency. For example, banks might validate currencies. They might validate transactions against fraud. Now, in Bitcoin, this validation is basically done in a decentralized way by the other parties, the other nodes in the Bitcoin network. Now, the goal of the remaining videos in this series is to walk through the underlying mechanics of Bitcoin transactions and really how they're validated, even though the system is decentralized. And there are some pretty amazing techniques that are used to make all this work. So I suspect that at this point, you may have a ton of questions about Bitcoin, and that's entirely to be expected. Bitcoin is a very complex protocol. It has many moving parts. And I think it's critical when you're trying to understand something as complex and wrap your head around something as sophisticated as Bitcoin. It's important to get exposed to all of the parts first so that you can ultimately get a flavor for how they fit together. And hopefully the other videos in this series will help you to understand these different parts and along the way address many of the questions that you might have.
Okay. So now we're going over to the next one, overview.
How the protocol is implemented and used, okay? And then Bitcoin itself is also referred to sometimes as a cryptocurrency. And by Bitcoin is a new virtual currency system that's been gathering a lot of attention recently, and I thought I would do a series of videos where I
don't think I'm even going to go full screen.
dive into the innards of
how it looks
Bitcoin
with
and
my...
explain how it works in detail. And my plan for this first video in this series is to describe some of those mechanics at a high level. And then what I'll do in subsequent videos is dive a bit deeper into all of the underlying aspects that I touched upon within this first video. And my hope is that by the end of this video series, you'll know not only what a Bitcoin is, but you'll also understand the mechanics of how transactions are initiated. You'll see how verification occurs for those transactions, and you'll also learn what it means for someone to really engage in a process known as Bitcoin mining. That may be a term that you've heard if you've had any interest in Bitcoin recently. Now, I do want to point out also that the Bitcoin scheme is fairly involved. It requires some time to really cover all of the relevant details. And to me, the best way to really wrap your head around a scheme like Bitcoin is to really suspend belief for a bit and get exposed to all of these relevant details. Now, you'll undoubtedly have a lot of questions along the way, but my hope is that by the end of this video series, all of the relevant stones will have been overturned and your questions will have been appropriately answered. But it might take some time to get there, okay? And in part, that's because I'll try to describe things in a way that's sensible, and that might involve leaving some details out until I can explain enough pieces of the scheme and then adding those details in as I go along so that you're not inundated with too many minor points and nuances along the way, but you get a feel for the overall system as I go through things. So with that, let me go ahead and just dive right in. And first of all, I do want to point out that Bitcoin has been described really as a decentralized currency because there's no real central bank or entity that's involved in generating or transacting Bitcoins. And in fact, what happens in the context of a Bitcoin is that all of the transactions really require what's known as a peer-to-peer network, a network of just individual hosts that essentially collectively agree on different aspects of how the protocol is implemented and used, okay? And then Bitcoin itself is also referred to sometimes as a cryptocurrency. And by cryptocurrency, I mean that we use a lot of cryptographic techniques in order to facilitate or to really enable Bitcoin transactions to take place. And I'll do separate videos on some of these techniques, but just take it at face value right now that it's decentralized and is a type of cryptocurrency. Now, I also want to point out that the term Bitcoin itself can in fact be a bit confusing. And in many ways, Bitcoin transactions don't really resemble traditional coin transactions so much as they represent really entries in some type of a global ledger. And by that I mean that let's say you have a transaction taking place, and let's say the transaction is taking place within or among two parties, and we'll call them Alice and Bob, which are traditional names that are used in many cryptographic protocols to describe the parties involved. And imagine that Alice wants to transfer, or really wants to assign, a certain number of Bitcoins that she possesses over to Bob, okay? And you can think of this transaction really as an entry in a ledger of some sort, okay? And I also want to point out before proceeding that even though I've used terms like Alice and Bob, what I really mean in the context of Bitcoin is not the actual identities in the physical sense, but really that Alice and Bob are identities in the Bitcoin system. And these identities are just, in actual implementation, are just collections of numbers that do not have to be tied with Alice and Bob's real world identities. So in that capacity, you can think of Bitcoin identities really as effectively being pseudonyms, okay, rather than real names. And the idea is that Bitcoin then becomes more of a pseudonymous protocol where people are addressed by their pseudonyms, and that provides some level of privacy to users who want to transact using the Bitcoin system, okay? Now, in a transaction between Alice and Bob, what Alice will basically do is specify a few different numbers. She has to specify how many bitcoins she wants to allocate to Bob. So let's say Alice started off with 50 bitcoins of her own. She might decide that she wants to give, let's say, 30 of these bitcoins over to Bob, okay? And let's say she wants to have some number of bitcoins returned back to her. So you have to specify, or Alice has to specify rather, how much change she's going to get. So in this case, let's say her change is going to be 18 bitcoins for herself. And then the remaining 2 bitcoins are going to be a transaction fee. And we'll talk about what a transaction fee means a little later, and I think I'll also dive into it in future videos. But it's basically an incentive for other nodes in the Bitcoin network to help Alice in essentially validating some of the details of this transaction for Bob. Okay? Now, Alice will take these transaction details and apply what's known as a digital signature to these transaction details. And the digital signature is basically the mathematical analog of a traditional signature. It really binds Alice's identity to the details of this transaction. And by Alice's identity, again, I mean her identity within the Bitcoin system. And this binding is really done in a cryptographically strong way. Okay? Now, the details of this transaction, once it takes place, are going to be broadcast out. So Alice is going to take these transaction details and effectively just broadcast them out to all the nodes in the peer-to-peer network that represent Bitcoin nodes. Okay? Now, Bob, when he receives information about this transaction, he receives it over the peer-to-peer network, he'll probably sanity check some part of the transaction. For example, he might check that the numbers work out correctly, that Alice, let's say, started off with 50 bitcoins and is not trying to transfer more than 50 bitcoins to him, and so on and so forth. And he's going to have some mathematical assurance because of some of the cryptography involved that some of these claims are accurate, that Alice, let's say, has the bitcoins that she's claimed to possess, and that she's expressed an interest to assign those bitcoins to him. But what he won't know yet is whether Alice has really tried to transfer those same bitcoins to anyone else over the course of time, or maybe just prior to that point. And the way that we handle that situation, and by the way, I should point out that this concept of Alice trying to, let's say, spend coins twice, in the context of digital cash and electronic currency systems, this concept is known as double spending, and it's something you have to worry about when you have virtual currencies, because it's very easy for someone to just copy the numbers that represent this transaction and try to use them elsewhere. Okay? And the way we basically handle and reduce the risk of double spending is through a specific set of nodes in this peer-to-peer network who are known as Bitcoin miners. Okay, so you might have heard this term Bitcoin miners. And the Bitcoin miners are basically specific individuals, specific nodes within this peer-to-peer network. And what they basically do is they take all of the transactions that they see, and remember, they're listening to all these transactions, not just Alice and Bob's, but other transactions that are taking place. And they'll take those transactions, and ultimately they will take those transactions and compile them into what's known as a transaction block. Okay, so it's basically a recording of all the previously unrecorded transactions. Okay, so if you think of a single transaction, let's say, as a ledger item, you could think of a transaction block as representing, let's say, an entire page in a ledger book. Okay, and these Bitcoin miners will also include in this block, in addition to all these unrecorded transactions, they will also include in this block a special transaction that's meant just for themselves, to basically reward themselves for the effort of doing this mining. Okay? Now, a transaction block will also contain an encoding of the previous transaction block. Okay, so there's going to be some level of continuity. And then Bitcoin miners will also include a specially crafted sequence of numbers associated with these transactions. And this sequence of numbers is known as a proof of work. Okay, and it's called a proof of work because it's something that's really hard to generate, something that requires a lot of effort to do, and that kind of makes it hard for just anybody to get involved with Bitcoin mining willy-nilly, but it's proof of work because it's of continuity themselves for the effort of doing this mining.
By the way, so I understand correctly, proof of work is actually something that's pretty much how like a lot of crypto work currently. And that's how Ethereum has worked for like the older version of Ethereum has worked for the past few years. But if I understand correctly, they're actually trying to no longer depend on proof of work and having like a different form of support for the actual cryptocurrencies. And I really have to try to understand how mining functions and how to properly invest into it, and see how it can potentially be lucrative over time. So it's kind of like a long-term project in many ways, like a long-term investment, but it's a long-term investment that could be very rewarding. So it's good for me to have that like peace of mind and focus in order to be able to study and not constantly have all these different thoughts in my mind. So I just wanted to take the time. I paused it. Everyone did a little bit there, and we were talking about the blocks, and then they didn't mention blockchain yet. But if I understand the concept of blockchain properly, it's essentially those blocks that he's referring to, and there's so many of them that it becomes like a blockchain. And yeah, all right. Press play. Bam.
Okay. Now, a transaction block will also contain an encoding of the previous transaction block. Okay, so there's going to be some level of continuity. And then Bitcoin miners will also include a specially crafted sequence of numbers associated with these transactions. And this sequence of numbers is known as a proof of work. Okay, and it's called a proof of work because it's something that's really hard to generate, something that requires a lot of effort to do, and that kind of makes it hard for just anybody to get involved with Bitcoin mining willy-nilly, but it requires that they really exhibit or exert some computational effort, basically in exchange for getting this extra reward of a payment, and also in exchange for getting this transaction fee that they're going to be promised by Alice to engage in this sort of work. Okay? And I'll talk about what proof of work protocols are in a separate video in more detail. Now, because each transaction block contains information about previous transaction, really what you end up having is not just a single block. You ultimately have what you can think of as a chain of transactions, called a transaction blockchain. Okay? And the idea is that as soon as a Bitcoin miner is able to construct a transaction blockchain containing all these unrecorded transactions and this proof of work, it'll broadcast the details of that chain out to all of the nodes, all the peers on that peer-to-peer network for Bitcoin. Okay? And then once the newly broadcast chain gets kind of verified and meets the right properties, the nodes on the network are just going to go ahead and start using it, and they're going to start appending new transaction blocks to that chain. Okay? They're going to take anything that hasn't yet been processed and start incorporating it into the transaction chain that was broadcast out by the node who came up with the proof of work correctly. Okay? Now, this transaction blockchain, really, what we're going to be doing in the context of Bitcoin is the nodes are only going to consider the transaction blockchain that reflects the greatest amount of work to generate its contents. And again, there's this proof of work that I mentioned that is used to kind of determine or identify what work was involved in coming up with the transaction blockchain. Okay? And the one that's the longest is going to be considered sacrosanct within the Bitcoin system. And future miners are supposed to only work off of the chain that is the most work put into it. Now, what's remarkable here is that this whole process is decentralized. No bank or no centrally trusted entity that was actually involved in the transaction. So hopefully this first video gave you a bit of a description, a flavor, if you will, for the high-level mechanics of the Bitcoin system. There are a lot of stones I have left unturned, and what I'll do in subsequent videos is start covering those details, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but hopefully the future videos will help answer some of those questions for you. Cryptographic hash functions are basically fundamental building blocks that are used within many cryptographic algorithms and protocols, and they have a number of very important applications in the context of information security as a whole. Now, some of the more common algorithms in this category that are known as cryptographic hash functions include things like MD5, and also it has some predecessors like MD4 and others, as well as algorithms like SHA-256, and actually SHA-256 is preceded by other algorithms like SHA-1 and so on. And also there are some algorithms that maybe you've heard of, or maybe that are a bit lesser known, but things like RIPE-MD and Blake and Skyne and others. Now, cryptographic hash functions are basically used as critical building blocks in many applications, and really the first motivating application, the first historical application of these types of hash functions was in the context of what's known as a digital signature. Digital signatures are used in so many different cryptographic applications today. They're the cornerstone of many e-commerce protocols. They are used in doing things like Bitcoin generation and so on. Cryptographic hash functions are also used in things like message authentication protocols, in pseudorandom number generation, and password security, even encryption to some degree. And in fact, aside from their use in digital signatures, these hash functions are also used in other places in the Bitcoin protocol as well. So first of all, let me talk about what a cryptographic hash function actually is. And of course, as the name implies, the first thing it's a hash function. And by hash function, I basically mean that it will take input. It's a mathematical function, a transformation, if you will, that takes a particular input, and we call this input a message. Okay, and the message can be of arbitrary length. And the hash function basically applies a mathematical transformation, or maybe a set of mathematical transformations to this input to produce a single output. And we typically call this output a digest, although sometimes you will see the output referred to as a tag, or as a hash, or as a fingerprint, but digest is sort of the most common nomenclature. In fact, MD5, which was one of the earlier hash functions, stands for message digest 5. Okay, and MD4 was message digest 4, and so on and so forth. Okay, now the message, as I mentioned briefly, can be of arbitrary size. It can be as long as you want or as short as you want, but the output, the size of the digest or the size of the tag, is going to be fixed in length. And for example, in the context of a hash function like, let's say, SHA-256, the digest will actually be exactly 256 bits in length. Okay, so it's going to have a fixed length output, but an arbitrary length input. Okay, and the other thing I want to point out about these cryptographic hash functions is that the function here is a deterministic function, and by that I mean that the output will always be the same for a given input. So if you have a given input, you're going to see the exact same output. You won't have a situation in which maybe a given input will have two different possible outputs. It's going to be consistent. Okay, now traditional hash functions that have been used in computer science for quite some time, and they are used in many computing applications. So for example, you may have heard of something like a hash function used in something called a hash table. But the kinds of hash functions that are used in tables, and I want to stress this, they aren't necessarily the same as cryptographic hash functions. Okay, the qualifier cryptographic here is very important, and it usually means or implies that hash function has to have a certain set of critical design goals and maybe some particular properties in mind that make it suitable for use in applications that use cryptography, or in cryptographic applications, areas where perhaps security or privacy or confidentiality or authentication is a serious concern. Okay, so first and foremost, and maybe describing some of these properties, is that, and maybe this almost goes without saying, one of the first properties you want of a cryptographic hash function is that it should be computationally efficient. And by that I mean that it shouldn't take a lot of time to compute the output from a given input. If you're given a message and you want to apply this set of transformations to that message to get a digest, that set of transformations should not take a long time to implement on a computer. It should be very fast, or relatively fast. And it almost goes without saying, but I think it is important to stress it and point it out, because I've seen people come up with grossly inefficient hash functions sometimes, and those would not be considered suitable in the context of when typical cryptographic hash functions are used for cryptographic applications. Okay? Now the second property you typically need in the context, and this is especially in the context of digital signing, is that you want it to be the case that it's hard to find two inputs that actually map to the same output. And I mean two distinct inputs whose corresponding digest is identical. And this property is typically referred to as collision resistance. Okay, and that means it's hard to find a colliding pair of inputs. So in other words, if you have two inputs, and let's say you have some message M1 and you have a message M2, okay, their output under the application of the hash function should not be the same. You won't ever have it be the same, that you won't ever have it be the case rather that the output of M1 and M2 under an application of the hash function is the same. They should never be the same. It should always be different. Okay. Now I should take a step back. Two inputs that actually map to the same output, and I mean two distinct inputs whose corresponding digest is identical. And this property is typically referred to as collision resistance. Okay, and that means it's hard to find a colliding pair of inputs. So in other words, if you have two inputs, and let's say you have some message M1 and message whose corresponding digest is identical. And this property is typically referred to as collision resistance. Okay, and that means it's hard to find a colliding pair of inputs. So in other words, if you have two inputs, and let's say you have some message M1 and you have a message M2, okay, their output under the application of the hash function should not be the same. You won't ever have it be the same. You won't ever have it be the case, rather, that the output of M1 and M2 under an application of the hash function is the same. They should never be the same. It should always be different. Okay. Now I should take a step back here and point out that, of course, in practice, given that messages can be of arbitrary size, and given that the input, or the output rather, is a fixed size, it's not mathematically possible to guarantee that the output will always be different for two distinct messages. But what you typically want is not that the outputs are necessarily different, but that it's hard to find two distinct messages that produce the same output. We know that they exist by virtue of the fact that they're the hash in only a finite and small number, or relatively small number compared to the number of messages, a smaller number of possible digest values. But aside from that consideration, it should be hard. It should take a long time, and by long I mean an astronomically long time, to find two distinct messages that would result in the same output under the application of the hash function. Okay? Now, the third thing I want to point out is that in many cases, you might want also, in the context of a hash function, for the hash function to be able to hide information about the inputs. In other words, given the output, it should be hard to glean anything useful or interesting about the input. Okay, any relevant detail, and I don't just mean the whole input, but maybe even something as simple as, was the input an even number or an odd number? I mean, that should be the kind of thing that should be hard to infer when you see the output. Even something as simple as the evenness or oddness of the input. Okay. The fourth property I want to point out is that you typically want the output to be well distributed. In other words, the output should look random. In other words, it should look like a set of coin flips took place, not that there was a predictable way in which the output was created. Okay, and really that, and you can think of it maybe more. It's almost as if you flipped a bunch of coins to get to the output. It should look just that random. Okay. And so what you can really think of cryptographic hash functions as is perhaps maybe the mathematical analog of a meat grinder of sort. It can take inputs and apply these mathematical transformations to them, such that the output looks, for all intents and purposes, completely random and unrelated to the original input. Okay? Now I do want to make a few quick remarks about these particular properties. And first of all, they are interrelated. For example, if you have a situation where the outputs, let's say, really appear to bear no relationship to the input, and the outputs also look like it, that will in fact give you, to a large degree, a lot of the collision resistance properties, because just the fact that you can't predict the output and the fact that it hides all this information implies that it's going to be hard to find two inputs that are distinct that map to the same output. And so sometimes you get one property in exchange for the others. Now, the second thing I want to point out is that typically these properties in practice, or maybe even in the underlying mathematics, are things that you hope for, but you can't always guarantee that they'll always hold. And it may be entirely possible that you could design a hash function that you think is completely collision resistant, but someone might come along a year from now and come up with a more clever way for finding a collision. Maybe they'll find a clever shortcut that does not involve doing a brute force search of any sort. Okay, and it turns out that cryptographers, for better or worse, currently do not have any mathematical techniques. They haven't developed techniques for being able to work around some of these limitations. And so we often do take it on face value that these schemes are secure based on how long they've been around. Okay? Now I also want to point out, and the last thing I want to point out, is that this treatment that I've given is not meant to be mathematically rigorous by any stretch of the imagination. There are far more precise ways to describe these underlying properties. But my hope instead is that this video gives you maybe a bit of a flavor for what is required for a cryptographic hash function without maybe getting bogged down in some of the mathematical minutiae and formalism. A digital signature is basically the mathematical mechanism for essentially combining a public sequence of numbers with a given digital message. And you can really think of a digital signature in many ways as the electronic analog of a physical signature. So a digital signature is basically the mathematical mechanism for essentially combining a public sequence of numbers with a given digital message. And you can really think of a digital signature in many ways as the electronic analog of a physical signature. So in a physical signature, you'll typically affix, let's say, a sequence of characters representing your name or your identity to a document. Okay, and this process effectively binds your identity to that document. And more so, by formulating the characters in your name in maybe some particularly unique or peculiar way that's unique to you, the hope is that nobody will be able to forge your name on that document. Now, in a digital signature scheme, it turns out you can achieve these kinds of properties mathematically. Now, some of the more well-known digital signature schemes include things like the RSA digital signature scheme, the Shamir-Edelman scheme. There's also a scheme known as DSS, which is the digital signature standard, actually. And actually, if you were to use a scheme like RSA or DSS, in my mind, it's actually a lot harder to forge these digital signatures than it is to forge a handwritten signature. So this particular video, I'll try to describe the overall higher level mechanics, if you will, of a digital signature. But I won't actually go into or describe the underlying mathematical details of, let's say, a specific scheme like RSA or DSS, at least not in this video. So the way that a digital signature scheme works is, let's say you have a user, and we're going to call her Alice, and let's say Alice wants to digitally sign a document. In the scheme, in a digital signature scheme, Alice is going to first generate two keys, and these two keys are known as the sign-in key, which is a private key, so I'm going to use red to denote it. The sign-in key is SK. And then Alice is also going to generate a separate key known as a verification key. Now, the actual process of coming up with the sign-in key and the verification key kind of happens concurrently. Alice will generate these two keys at the same time, and they're going to have a mathematical relationship. Okay, but the interesting thing is that you want it to be the case that the verification key is public and the sign-in key will be private, but more so, in a digital signature scheme, it should be hard to come up with the verification key, or rather, it should be hard to come up with the sign-in key, rather, if you only see the verification key. Okay? Now let's consider what a digital signature on a message will entail. So basically, if you have a message, and let's call this message M, and you wish to digitally sign that message, what you're going to basically do is apply a mathematical transformation. Alice is going to apply a mathematical transformation to the message M and her sign-in key SK. Okay, and the result of that transformation, the output of that transformation, will be a special sequence of numbers that we call the signature on the message M. Okay. Now the interesting thing here is that the signature basically is one that is derived from a combination of the message M together with the sign-in key, the private sign-in key of Alice, and it's going to effectively produce a short, ideally a relatively short sequence of numbers as an output. Okay? And in particular, digital signature schemes should be designed, or they typically are designed, so that only the person who possesses the signing key, that private signing key, is capable of generating this type of an output, this type of a signature, S sub m on the message m. Okay? Now, the verification process is kind of analogous to the signing process, but it involves the public verification key. So in the verification process, you actually have three different inputs. So the first input will be the message that you want to verify the signature of. You also need, in addition to the message, you need to get as input the signature on that message. What does that S sub m look like? And then finally, the final input to the verification scheme will be the public key, the public verification key that belongs to Alice. Okay, and these three inputs are put in, and there's a mathematical transformation that's applied to these three inputs. And basically, what that mathematical transformation is trying to ascertain or to check is that the signature that you see corresponds is one that would have been produced by Alice's private signing key. And this private signing key in turn corresponds to Alice's public verification key. Now, what I think is really remarkable is that you can actually carry out this process with just the verification key, that you don't actually need the signing key to validate a digital signature. You don't even need it inadvertently or indirectly. You can do everything. You can verify everything with knowledge of only the public verification key. And the verification procedure basically outputs kind of a yes or no. It tells you, should I accept the signature or should I reject it? Okay? It's a basic validation procedure. And so as you can see, the process of signing effectively will bind this public verification key. It binds the public verification key to Alice somehow, right? Because Alice is the one who published this verification key and told the whole world, hey, this is my verification key in the system, and only I will be able to sign messages that will be considered valid with respect to that verification key. Okay? And because the message is now being essentially bound to this public key, and if you think of the public key as an identifier of sorts, maybe an identifier for Alice, then you can think of digital signing as a process that basically binds an identity to an underlying message. And that really gives us, in the mathematical sense, it gives us the analog of a traditional handwritten signature. Okay? Now I want to make two remarks, and I think they're particularly relevant. So first of all, you'll notice that the transformation that produces the actual digital signature itself, okay, this transformation right here that produces S sub m, this transformation basically takes the message. It takes the message as one of its inputs, okay? And what that means is that the signature is dependent on the message. If you change the message, you'll get a different signature. Now, in this sense, a digital signature is actually different from a traditional handwritten signature. Okay, your handwritten signature probably doesn't change, or more or less stays the same regardless of what it is you're signing. But your digital signature is very sensitive to what you're signing, and it will vary depending on what you sign. If you sign a different message, you'll get a different signature as an output. Okay? The second remark I want to make is that digital signatures are often associated with cryptographic hash functions, and I've already done a video on cryptographic hash functions, and in fact, I mentioned in that video, and I'll reiterate here, that the first cryptographic hash functions were actually designed specifically with digital signatures in mind as their killer application, if you will. So in particular, what typically happens is that before you actually sign an arbitrary message, a message that you want to sign, before you sign this message, you're going to basically apply a cryptographic hash function to that message, and you're going to get an output from that function, the cryptographic hash function. You'll get a shorter output, the digest of that cryptographic hash function. And then what you do in a signing algorithm is that rather than signing the original message, you will first hash it and then sign the hash of the message. You'll sign the resulting digest instead of the original message. Okay? And this two-step paradigm of doing kind of hashing and then signing really ends up simplifying the process of digital signing, since you are dealing with an arbitrary length input, but instead you're working with a fixed length quantity. Okay? And this hash and sign paradigm actually is safe as under the application of the hash function. In other words, you can't come up with two messages that are different, but whose output when the hash function is applied to them are identical. Okay? In other words, the hash function, as long as it's collision resistant, okay, will result in a secure signature scheme with this hash and sign paradigm. Okay? Okay, now you can probably think about this for a moment, but if you could find, let's say, two input messages that are distinct and that map to the same output under an hash function, that would in fact lead to some bizarre problems, because a signature on the first message would then be identical to a signature on the second message, since in both cases what you're doing is you're not signing the actual message, you're signing the hash of the message. So if the hashes are identical, you'll end up with the identical signature on two different messages. And that could create problems like making it easy for maybe a particular message to be forged under this digital signature approach, and that's obviously something you don't want. You don't want someone to be able to come up with a signature on a different message as opposed to maybe the intended to sign. Okay? Now it is possible, and I just want to make this clear, it's possible to describe digital signatures with a lot more mathematical formalism, but my hope with this video really was to give you a flavor, if you will, without drilling into all of the underlying nuances in mathematics. At its core, a Bitcoin is just basically a chain of digital signatures that really reflect the coin's path through the Bitcoin ecosystem. And here I think it's actually conceptually easier to think of Bitcoins as collective entries into a ledger rather than as a physical coin, because if you think about it, in a ledger you have a record of transaction histories, which is what happens in Bitcoin, whereas with a physical coin, it's more like memoryless. There's no history in a physical coin of where that coin has really been in the past. Okay? So in this context, you can think of a transaction as just a digitally signed declaration by one party of its intent to transfer some Bitcoins that they possess to another set of parties. And when I say one party possesses a certain number of Bitcoins, I really just mean here that there's some previous transaction on record that everybody's agreed to, in which the party now transferring the Bitcoins was itself the recipient of a previous transfer of those Bitcoins. All right? Now, I realize it's a bit convoluted, so maybe to help better understand the mechanics of a transaction, I can do an example of what would happen in the context of an actual Bitcoin transaction. So let's say we have a party, and let's call her Alice, which is the common name we use for parties in cryptographic schemes. And let's say she wants to transfer some Bitcoins to Bob, okay? And let's say she has an intention of wanting to transfer 50 Bitcoins to Bob, okay? Now, remember that anybody who transacts in the Bitcoin ecosystem is actually not transacting under their real name or their actual name, but rather they are known by a very specific identity, a pseudonym within the Bitcoin ecosystem, and that identity, that pseudonym, actually corresponds to a public verification key for a digital signature scheme. So in this case, let's say Alice's identity in the system is really some public verification key, which we'll call VK of A, so Alice's verification key. And in the context of Bob, let's say his public verification key is some VK sub B. So these are keys that are used within the digital signature schemes. And so we can assume that Alice has generated this key at some point and that she made it public, and that Bob did the same thing. And so now they both have identities within the system, and these identities are just sequences of numbers that correspond to public keys for verification in the context of a cryptographic digital signature. All right? Now remember that these values also correspond to private values. So each person who's got a public key will have a corresponding private key associated with that public key, and in this case we'll call the private key or the secret key, which is in fact a signing key in this context, SK of Alice, and we'll say that Bob's signing key is some SK of Bob, okay? And he's private. Now let's say that Alice herself has received in the past 3 transactions of Bitcoins from other parties. Let's say she got 25 Bitcoins from Carol, and we'll call Carol VK of C to associate that with her key. Let's say she got 20 public, or 20 Bitcoins rather, from David, and let's say she got 20 more Bitcoins from Ted. Okay, so these Bitcoins correspond to different people that provided Alice with Bitcoins in the past. And so as you can see, Alice now has an aggregate of 65, which is 20 plus 20 plus 25 Bitcoins. And so as a result, she has a sufficient number to be able to transfer 50 of those Bitcoins to Bob, okay? So to start off with, a transaction from Alice to Bob for 50 Bitcoins will contain information about these previous transactions. So each of these previous transactions where Alice received some Bitcoins, these will have been recorded in the Bitcoin ecosystem, so they're going to be made public just like every other transaction. And so what Alice can actually do is she can take some representation of these transactions and include them as part of the new transaction with Bob. Basically, as an anchor point to say, hey, I received these previous Bitcoins, and now I'm going to transfer some portion of these Bitcoins to you, Bob, okay? So, in this context, actually, she does not need to include the full transaction details in the actual transaction record to Bob. What she can instead do is take the transaction details and apply a cryptographic hash function to them to get a series of digests for each transaction. So in this case, let's say she has a digest that corresponds to the transaction from Carol. She'll have a digest that corresponds to the transaction from David, and she'll have a digest that corresponds to the transaction from Ted. Okay, and she'll basically include each of these digests into the transaction record. And what these digests allow you to do, or really allow anyone to do for that matter, is they can verify the chain of ownership of these Bitcoins, because they can simply take all the previous transaction records, which again are made public, and apply cryptographic hash functions to these different transaction records, and they can verify that these cryptographic hashes, when applied to those transaction records, provide you back with these values d sub c, d sub d, and d sub t, and that in turn provides you with some type of a cryptographic guarantee. Because we're using cryptographic hash functions, we have a cryptographic guarantee that Alice was the ultimate recipient of these transactions from these different parties. We have this nice history that we can record, and that we can essentially ascertain in this fashion. All right? And because we're using cryptographic hash functions, we now have some assurance that Alice couldn't have so easily cheated the system. All right? So at this point in the transaction,
Can like barely breathe. It's like really, really annoying. I think I'm gonna make myself some tea again.
they'll kind of draw a line so you can kind of see where the transaction details are recorded. So at this point in the transaction, we have details about Alice's ownership of these 65 Bitcoins, and she has enough information in that transaction so that anybody can verify that she possesses, right? So you can think of this part of the transaction really as representing the input to the transaction. Now, in addition to the input portion of the transaction, there's typically also an output portion. I'm going to put that output portion up here, but let me label it. Okay, and so for starters, in the output portion, she has to include, or Alice has to include, a list of recipients for her Bitcoins. And since Alice wants to, let's say, transfer these Bitcoins to Bob, she has to specify Bob's identity in the system, which in fact, as we mentioned earlier, was Bob's public key. So we'll say that she'll mention V sub k of B, okay? And she also has to record and mention, at this stage, how many coins she wants to transfer to Bob. And as we said earlier, we were going to assume that Alice wanted to transfer exactly 50 of her Bitcoins to Bob, Okay, so she's going to specify the number of 50. Actually, in reality, she'll specify another number, but it's going to represent 50 Bitcoins for Bob. Okay? Now, in order for Alice to get back change, because she has 65 Bitcoins kind of coming in, and she is only giving 50 back to Bob, what she might then do is decide that she's going to specify 14 of those Bitcoins to be returned back to her in the form of change. Okay, so 14 of those Bitcoins are going to be reassigned back to Alice's public key. All right, and what Alice will then do is she's going to take all of this data, this transaction data, this input and this output, and she's going to digitally sign that data. She's going to use her signing key to digitally sign all this data like you would with a digital signature, and she's going to append that signature to the actual contents of the transaction record, and that'll effectively bind Alice's identity with the transaction record itself, okay? And the reason it's going to bind it is we're using a digital signature scheme, and so anybody who possesses Alice's public key, which again is made public, can validate that only Alice could have created this block, because only Alice in theory has a signature that corresponds to her public key, because she's the only person who in theory should possess the private signing key corresponding to her public key, all right? Then all of this data will actually be broadcast out. So this transaction data will then get broadcast out to all the different peers and the nodes in the Bitcoin network. So everybody in the Bitcoin network will basically know now that VK sub A is trying to send 50 Bitcoins to VK sub B. Okay. Now at this point, you may have noticed a slight discrepancy here that Alice started off with 65 coins kind of on the input side, but on the output side, she only has 50 plus 14 or 64 coins that are being accounted for, okay? So there's this issue, what happens with this one last remaining coin? There's kind of this one implicit coin hanging around that has not been accounted for. And what we're going to do with that coin is actually going to be used as a transaction fee. Alice is basically saying that this one leftover coin should be provided as a transaction fee to what's known as a Bitcoin miner, okay? And a Bitcoin miner, as I mentioned in a previous video, is basically an entity in the Bitcoin system. Anybody can be a Bitcoin miner, actually. But it's a node in the Bitcoin network who engages really in the effort to help with the broader validation of this transaction. So what do I mean by broader validation? Well, if you think about it, at this point, we've just used cryptographic hashing and digital signing to validate that Alice, at some point, possessed the requisite Bitcoins in the system, and that she not only publicly announced her intention to transfer some of the Bitcoins to Bob, but she digitally signed that public pronouncement, if you will, as a result of which her public verification key, which is her identity in the Bitcoin system, is now bound to that transaction. But what Bob doesn't know yet, even though he knows all these things and he can validate them, what Bob doesn't know yet is whether Alice tried to, let's say, previously sign or assign those exact same coins to somebody else. Let's say Alice has a friend named Eve. Okay, maybe Alice decided she's going to send these Bitcoins not only to Bob, but also is going to try to send these same Bitcoins to Eve. And Bob at this point may not have the assurance that Alice has not tried to engage in these types of shenanigans. All right. And so the tricky part here is that even though all the transactions we've talked about have been made public, because Bitcoin requires all transactions to be made public, we still need a mechanism, and this has to be a decentralized mechanism that does not require a trusted third party, per se. We need a decentralized mechanism for agreeing really on the order in which transactions actually took place so that we can resolve any disputes about someone trying to double spend. Okay? And it's that requirement, that timestamp, that decentralized timestamp, if you will, which is where Bitcoin miners play a very important role in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I'll talk about how that works and how we deal with transaction timestamping in subsequent videos. A proof-of-work protocol is a vehicle by which somebody can effectively prove to you they've engaged in a significant amount of computational effort. Now, proof-of-work protocols often amount to puzzles, and these puzzles that can, on the one hand, be challenging to solve, and by that I mean some serious computational effort and really can't be short-circuited. But on the other hand, that effort can actually be easily verified, and it can be verified in far less time than it took to conduct that effort in the first place. Okay? And there are a number of applications of that protocol. So, for example, if you've heard of the Bitcoin electronic payment system.
There's 3 more videos of these, or 4 more. That's like another 40 minutes. Pretty much, if I understand correctly, right? And another 10 minutes, another 10 minutes, 12 minutes. Yeah, so this whole lecture is gonna pretty much last for about another hour or so. So it's right now, it's 2 o'clock already. Wow. Yeah, this was intense. Anyhow, this is like what was it, like a 2-hour lecture or something like that. I think I started around noon, so maybe 1 or noon. I don't know when I started this thing, but anyhow, I'm gonna go make myself some tea. I'm having like a huge congestion. This is interesting stuff for sure. I'm gonna have to do like actual research and reading and everything, and being focused on like a specific topic. Like I said, a lot of the videos that I'm making are going to be not like super interesting or anything like that. It's just so that I'm making sure that I'm showing what I'm doing throughout like my daily days, and that I'm making sure that I'm being productive. I feel like so many days have gone by, and I always feel like I set out goals in my head, and then I'm not like actually putting the time in. And despite like me actually doing that, it feels like if I'm not working for someone else, that like my brain shuts down, and I definitely see myself as a realistic employer to my own self and potentially to others in the future. So with that said, I just got to be able to prove to myself that I can still learn new things, that I still have neuroplasticity and the capacity to learn things that I actually want to learn and to use them for my advantage. So, yeah, part of my nasally voice, I'm definitely making myself some tea, and yeah, I'll probably be also, I love like music and stuff like that. So, if I have like a nasally voice when I sing, I'm sure I'll try to figure that out as well. But right now, it's not really about singing or music or any of that sort. Right now, it's more so about like learning about Bitcoin. I watched this documentary called Coin. It was on iTunes, and it's this one right here. So it's all about like the founding of Coinbase, and I found it. It was on iTunes, and yeah, it was like actually like really cool. So I saw this the other day, and this is kind of what triggered that desire for me to want to do a little bit more research on it, and yeah, I definitely see myself as being able to be successful in some sort of way, and wow, my nose is like clearing up for some reason, or it feels like it's clearing up. So, this is kind of what led to me wanting to do like a little bit more research. I saw this; it's like brand new, like it was just released like this year. So, yeah, hopefully I'll be able to do something that'll be successful, or that will allow me to make some money. Well, not making money is probably not the right expression, but uh, I would say more like earning, or yeah, earning money through different things. So I gotta find a way to do it. It really matters to me a lot, and I think that there's like all this potential for me to succeed financially, and eventually find my financial freedom, and yeah, I mean that's totally possible. So like I said, I'm gonna prepare myself for the other half or the other hour of the lecture that's upcoming. just gonna sit down, make myself some tea, and then I'll be back to this. And yeah, hopefully my nasally voice and my congestion will go away. But it is really cold. So it's pretty much there's like a opening in some of the roofing parts here, so there's just cold air is just coming right in up into the, the property, the house here that I'm currently residing in. Oh, so I'm back. Yeah, so this guy, pretty cool. Honestly, it was definitely a cool documentary. I forgot what his name was. Was it from Brian Armstrong? Yeah, maybe that's probably his name. Honestly, it was a really cool documentary. He was there, and then he had his friend, co-founder of the company, and then like the co-founder of the company helps him at a certain point, and it's all like real life. So it's like it really happened over the last 10 years or so. It was like so cool stuff. This the whole premise of this kind of begins around the time that I was in university when I first got in. Although I was there for like an extended amount of time, but oh wow, it was kind of frustrating actually seeing some of my friends graduate way before me, and me still not having graduated. It's like really annoying. But my ability to learn new things shouldn't depend on whether I'm enrolled in a university or not. So, what I will say is the format under which I learned, which was at a much more high level than at in a high school or any school like that before it. The way the schedule functions, and it's really interesting. I definitely ought to check out also a bunch of different YouTubers that I really like and try to. Oh my gosh. And try to take notes on how to be a better learner, or if not a better one, a more efficient learner. I can breathe in from my right nostril. I gotta get ahead of myself and get too excited about it, because if I do that, there's a high likely chance that a couple seconds later I won't be able to anymore. So we're gonna try the satellite solution again. Sorry guys, it's so gross. I'm like literally disgusted right now. So grossed out. And just to inform myself in the future, it's myself right now and anyone who's watching this. I'm not actually a huge fan of shoving up things up my nose, so I don't think I need to discuss that topic any further. But I'm not a huge fan in general of doing that, so it's not my idea of fun. I'll just put it that way. If some other people enjoy doing that, that's their choice. Just don't want to have to end up doing shoving stuff up my nose, whether it's medically or not medically. Just not something I actually care to do, nor want to do. It's just it's not something that I enjoy doing. So yeah, I feel like I definitely my eyes are getting red. I like blew my nose so hard in the bathroom that like my eyes are getting red. But yeah, I've smoked cannabis. I put this video as not for kids, so I can probably say this safely. But I've smoked cannabis before, and I will say my eyes have gotten red from doing that specifically. But in this instance, my eyes are actually getting red from like blowing my nose so hard that there's probably I don't want to like pop my blood vessels in my eyes. It's just like unpleasant. So to return to the lessons, let's not get too sidetracked here. Faster I can finish this, the more I can do something else, and that's kind of what I
That
want to
system
do.
actually
Time
leverages
efficiency.
a proof of work scheme within the context of creating what are known as transaction blockchains. Okay. Now, aside from Bitcoin, which is a very recent user of these types of proof of work schemes, these schemes have been proposed in the past for other applications. For example, schemes have been proposed for doing things like deterring denial of service attacks or DOS attacks. And here the idea is that the requester, let's say of a particular service, would have to solve a very specific computational problem, a proof of work puzzle, before being allowed to use the service. And the idea here is that the computational effort exerted is effectively a way to throttle the requester. Okay, the responder can in turn easily check that the requester carried out the requisite work, and only if that work was carried out will the responder respond to that request for service. Okay. Now, the original application for these types of proof of work protocols, the first place that I've seen it proposed is in the context of being able to deter spam email. And then obviously we all know what spam email is, hopefully. These are messages that you don't want in your inbox that maybe come to you in an unsolicited fashion. And the idea here is that a proof of work protocol it turns out it can be tied to a particular email message. And this is conceptually like, let's say, affixing a postage stamp to a message. But rather than paying that stamp or paying for that stamp using money, you're basically paying for that stamp via CPU cycles. So for a legitimate sender who is only sending out a small number of messages, this type of proof of work protocol will not amount to very much. It's going to be a minor deterrent since it's only executed a very small number of times. It's kind of an impediment, but it's not something that's so unreasonable. Okay? Now, for a spammer who might be sending out a lot of messages, maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of messages, it might be prohibitively expensive to repeatedly expend so many CPU cycles for each message and each sender to whom that message is being sent. Okay? So hopefully this gives you a flavor for some of the applications of these proof of work protocols. Let me actually dive into how they work in practice. Okay? So first of all, the way that I like to think of these protocols is that typically they work relative to a given challenge string. I'm going to call this challenge string, and we'll label it with the letter C. So C is going to be kind of a challenge string. And what the person trying to engage in the protocol will do, the prover of the work, will basically try to come up with a corresponding proof that is tied to this challenge string. It's going to be kind of a response associated with this challenge that has a very specific mathematical property in relation to this challenge. Okay? And as you point out, maybe that when I talk about a challenge string here, for example, in the context of spam, this challenge string might actually represent an email message. Okay? So it's going to be something very specific to the task at hand. Okay? Now what the prover will do is come up with a response string, and let's call the response string, we'll call the response string R. Actually, let's use the term P for it, since maybe we can think of it as a proof. Okay, a proof for response. Okay, and the idea is that the prover will come up with this proof or response string, and he has to come up with a string such that when you concatenate the challenge and the response, and you take the two together and you apply a cryptographic hash function. So let's say I come up with a cryptographic hash function like SHA-256 or anything of that nature. If I take the challenge string and the proof string and concatenate together and apply the cryptographic hash function, apply these mathematical transformations that represent the cryptographic hash function, I want to come up with a proof string such that the output under this hash function will have a very specific property. And that property is the prefix of the output. The first large number of bits will all be 0. So let's say the first 40 bits or first 30 bits or some number of bits will be 0, okay? And then the other bits can be whatever they would normally be, okay? So obviously what you're trying to do here is come up with a proof string that has a relationship with a challenge string. The relationship happens to be one that happens, or that is taken with respect to a particular hash function and really incorporates or considers what the output of the hash function will be when the proof string is concatenated with the challenge string, okay? Now if you, let's say, have a good cryptographic hash function, then the only known way to find this type of a proof string is to effectively try a lot of different possibilities, effectively doing brute force by trying a lot of different proof strings until you find one that works. Now, if you, let's say, needed to find an output that contained about 40 consecutive zeros in it, that would require you to perform about 2 to the power 40 steps, okay? 2 to the power 40 different hash function invocations. You'd have to try 2 to the 40 different strings, and one of them would likely work if you tried 2 to the 40 such strings. That actually requires you to try about, and 2 to the 40, just to give you a sense, is approximately 1 trillion. So if you tried a trillion different strings out, and you hash them each, you would likely come up with one string that had the first 40 bits being 0. Now sometimes it might take you a lot less than a trillion steps, sometimes it might take you a little bit more, okay? You might get very lucky, you might get very unlucky, but on average it will take you about 1 trillion steps to find a string where the first 40 bits are equal to 0, okay? So this is something that's not easy, but it's also not outside the realm of possibility. Now to understand why it's really hard to solve these types of proof of work schemes more efficiently than maybe simply doing
Also, right now,
I think it's helpful to
right now he's talking about the computer's work, what the computer has to work to complete the proof of work and then validate the blockchain. If I understand correctly. So I think that's what the miners get paid for. Like they earn a little reward every time they complete that little work, which is heavy on the video drive, which is why so many miners have all these video drive rigs.
That the output of a cryptographic hash function looks more or less random. In fact, each output bit looks like a series of coin flips, okay? So it's kind of like flipping a coin, and if it comes up heads, you would have a 0, and if it comes up tails, you can use it as a 1. And so what you're really doing is saying, if I flipped 40 coins, what are the odds that you would have 40 consecutive heads on those 40 coin flips? Now obviously that likelihood is very small, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. If you took 40 coins and you flipped those 40 coins about 1 trillion times, you would actually expect to see one instance in which all 40 coins came up as heads, okay, out of 1 trillion tries, okay? Now, one interesting thing with these proof of work schemes is they can be ratcheted up or ratcheted down. So for example, let's say you want to require even more computational heavy lifting to come up with a correct proof string, okay? Let's say you want to increase the work that's going to be proved here. What you can effectively do in that case is you can just increase the requirement on the number of leading zeros. So every time you add an additional 0, you effectively double the computational horsepower needed on average. Okay, and that's because you're effectively requiring one more coin flip to come up heads, and that entails doubling the number of coin flips. Okay, so if I had 41 coin flips and I required 41 straight heads, that would require about twice as much effort as just requiring 40 straight heads. Okay, and likewise, every time you remove a 0 from consideration or from the requirement, that would reduce the computational horsepower needed to about half of what it was previously. So for example, if I only require the first 39 bits to be 0, that will require about half as many coin flips as requiring the first 40 bits to be 0. Okay? Now the neat thing is that once you come up with a solution, let's say that somebody tries, a trillion times, and they finally come up with a proof string that works, it's very easy to validate that this proof string, in fact, is a correct proof of work. All you have to do is you take the challenge and you take the proof string and you hash them together. So, for example, if somebody proposes this one string, let's call it p prime, all you do is you take the challenge and you take p prime and you input them into a hash function, okay, and you see if the first 40 bits are all 0. So all this requires you to do is apply a hash function once to the concatenation of c and p prime, and you can verify that the output indeed has the requisite number of zeros in front of it. And if you see that the output has the requisite number of zeros, then you can consider the proof of work valid, because you know it must have taken somebody a lot of time, a lot of tries really, to provide or come up with the string p prime such that the concatenation of c and p prime gives you a number of zeros under the application of this cryptographic hash function. So as you can see, these schemes are quite simple, but quite clever at the same time. They really amount to coming up with a proof string that has a very specific mathematical relationship.
Yeah, so this is Khan Academy, and math is clearly a lot of fun, or it can be at least, and in its usefulness, and what you do with mathematics. That being able to solve different kinds of problems, especially with real life applications, can, give you a certain sense of pride in the work that you've completed and all that stuff. But in this specific instance, we're talking about the proof of work that is made by computers. So it's the mathematics there is not necessarily, it's not like you need to actually try to solve all the problems that will be solved by an actual computer. And having that computer is essentially like buying a computational workforce to be able to complete those, and to then be able to earn a certain amount of bitcoins, which will potentially be converted into whatever currency might be desired, or to be held into a specific account or into a specific key as bitcoins, whilst the value potentially, hopefully, augments like it has clearly over these past 10 years. So let's keep going with the video.
With the original challenge string. So hopefully this video gave you a flavor for the mechanics of how these proof of work protocols work. This or salient piece for understanding the mechanics of how bitcoins work is what we call the transaction blockchain. So if you recall, in the previous video, a motivating example of a user, Alice, who wanted to, let's say, send some number of bitcoins to another user, Bob, in the system. And what Alice had to do to initiate that transaction was to construct a transaction record of sorts that contained information about the transaction and that was signed with Alice's signing key, and that actually contained Alice's public verification key and Bob's public verification key as well. Okay? And that transaction information was basically broadcast out, as we mentioned, to the entire Bitcoin ecosystem, to all the nodes on the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network. Now, the various nodes in the Bitcoin ecosystem are going to sit there. They're going to receive information about this transaction, but they're also going to be getting information about a lot of other transactions that are taking place around the same time. Okay? And what these nodes are going to start doing is they're going to work on incorporating this transaction record into really a ledger of all transactions that have ever taken place in the Bitcoin system. And so what happens is that each node basically starts off by taking all of the previously unincorporated transactions that they've ever received. So there's going to be all these transactions out there that have kind of happened within a given time window. And so there's all these Bitcoin transactions kind of floating around. And these nodes, these Bitcoin miners, as they're called, are going to receive information about all these different transactions, and they're going to start working on incorporating those transactions, okay? Now, their first goal is to collate these transactions, okay, into what's known as a transaction block. So if you recall our ledger analogy, a single Bitcoin transaction essentially corresponds to a proposed entry in a ledger. In that capacity, a transaction block would basically correspond to an entire page in the ledger where you have multiple transactions that are listed in that page of the ledger. And the goal, the Bitcoin miner's goal, is to really, essentially, to take that page and get it added to the global ledger book, the global comprehensive ledger book. All right. Now, to engage in this sort of work, what these nodes will basically do is they'll first take all the transactions that have been broadcast out, and let's say these 4 transactions have been broadcast out, okay, and they're going to basically hash these transactions in pairs, okay, and basically in a tree-like structure. So they'll take these 2 transactions and they'll apply a cryptographic hash function to those details, and they'll get a corresponding digest. They'll do the same for these 2, and then they'll take these 2 digests and hash them to get a single digest value. And this digest effectively encodes all of the transactions that were previously unincorporated and that were received by these individual nodes. All right, and then this digest is basically going to be combined. It's going to be combined with the hash of the transaction block that was previously accepted by the network. So you can imagine that the network will have a series of transaction blocks that were previously accepted, and in fact, every transaction block, as I mentioned just now, incorporates the previous transaction block. So this transaction block will incorporate the one that was used just before it, and this transaction block will incorporate the one that was used just for it, and then it's going to go on literally until the beginning of Bitcoin time. So this is really where the beginning of time for the Bitcoin system. Okay, this is just time equals 0 for Bitcoin. Okay, and they're going to take this last block, and they're going to essentially now take this last block and combine it with this most recent block. And so if you imagine that you have now not just an individual block, but because each individual block incorporates the block before it, we're not dealing anymore with an isolated or distinct block of transactions. We're dealing with a chain of blocks that starts literally at the beginning of the entire Bitcoin system. All right? Now, when you do all this combination, at the end of the day, you're going to do some cryptographic hashing, and you basically will end up with a sequence of numbers, okay? And this sequence of numbers will be derived by incorporating all these blocks together. You'll get a sequence of numbers. And what we're going to basically do is take this sequence of numbers and convert that sequence of numbers into a challenge in a proof of work protocol, okay? Now, I did a separate video on proof of work protocols. I would encourage you to watch that if you want to get a better sense for how they work. But the short of it is that what the Bitcoin mining node has to do at this point is he'll take the challenge, and he'll have to come up with a separate sequence of numbers, which we typically term the proof, or the proof of work. And this proof of work has to have a very specific mathematical property. What that property entails is that if you take the challenge numbers and you take these proof numbers and you concatenate them together and you make them the input to a cryptographic hash function, okay, the resulting output has to have a large prefix of zeros, okay? And that doesn't have to be all zeros, but a large portion of the beginning, the prefix has to be all zeros, okay? And if you think about it for a moment, given that cryptographic hash functions, given that their output tends to look fairly random, it's unlikely that in any given instance, you are going to see a proof, a proposed proof that provides you with a large string of zeros at the beginning. And so what the Bitcoin miner will have to do is, on average, he'll have to try many possible choices for these proof numbers until he finally gets lucky and he stumbles upon one that has this kind of offbeat or strange statistical property. Okay? And the actual difficulty of finding these proof numbers, as you can tell, is dependent on exactly how many leading zeros are required. Okay? The more leading zeros you require in this proof, the longer it takes to actually solve the problem, the longer it takes to actually come up with a proof that works with respect to a given challenge. The fewer zeros that you require, the less time it'll take. Now, the exact number of bits, of 0 bits required in the Bitcoin protocol actually does change over time. It gets calibrated, and it's designed so that on average, the average time taken across the whole system should be about 10 minutes, okay? So you want it to take about 10 minutes for at least one node to come up with a valid proof. But keep in mind that a lot of nodes are working on this proof concurrently. All right? Now, once this proof of work is found, let's say that the proof of work is eventually found, the Bitcoin miner will announce the results to the overall peer-to-peer network. So he's going to take this proof and really all the challenge and so on, and he's going to announce it to all the other nodes, and they're not going to see that, hey, there's this proof out there, somebody found it, let's drop the other stuff we were doing, and we're going to now start to work and build on top of this new proof. And remember, this new proof and this new challenge, these all incorporate all the previous transaction blocks. So really what they're starting to do is they're starting to work off of a new updated transaction block chain. Okay, and they're going to incorporate any new unincorporated transactions into that new transaction blockchain. Now, there are a couple of points I want to make here. So first of all, as part of constructing these transaction blocks, and really as part of incorporating them into a transaction blockchain, Bitcoin miners are actually allowed one little special treat. They are allowed to include in that transaction block a special node for themselves, and this node will basically be a little reward that they can get. And let me use the kind of a greenish color for that reward. So they can take the first block, the first transaction item, okay, the first transaction record, and they can put in that transaction record, they can assign a reward to themselves, okay? Now, the amount of that reward will change over time, but I do want to point out that what this transaction is typically called is called a Coinbase transaction, or a generation transaction. This is how new coins get included in the Bitcoin system. So whenever a miner succeeds in coming up with a proof, as part of that, he'll have been allowed to come up with his own transaction to reward himself, a special reward for expending the effort necessary to come up with this proof and for doing all this work associated with adding a new transaction block to the existing transaction blockchain for Bitcoin. All right, and I think that's reasonable. After all, these nodes are using a lot of computational power to come up with these proofs, and that if they're using computational power, that must mean that somewhere along the line somebody's spending money on electricity and so on. Now, I also want to point out that in addition to this Coinbase award, the nodes who are doing the Bitcoin mining, the ones who succeed, also get to collect the transaction fees that were specified in the transaction record. So if you recall, a person issuing a transaction in Bitcoin can allocate or set aside a certain amount of money, maybe it could be a Bitcoin or a fractional Bitcoin, for the node who succeeds in coming up with the actual proof of work, and effectively the node that succeeds in being able to add that transaction to the overall Bitcoin transaction blockchain. And so that node that does the work that succeeds gets a reward of a transaction. This could actually become quite large, because the node will not only get the transaction fee for one transaction, it'll get the transaction fee for all the transactions that appeared in the current block. So it's going to get the aggregate over all these different transactions. All right. Now, the second point I want to make is that it might be possible for two nodes to solve the proof of work independently of each other, and somehow they may both end up trying to add to that existing chain in some way. So you may get some weird chain forking happening. Now, if that happens, the peers in the Bitcoin network will basically break a tie by sticking with the longest chain. And by longest, I don't mean the one that has maybe the most transactions in it. I really mean the one that has the highest aggregate difficulty associated with that underlying proof of work protocol in each of the transaction blocks. So they'll basically look at the total amount of effort that was required to generate that chain with regard to that proof of work, and whichever chain has the most work associated with it is the chain that's sacrosanct. It's the chain that everybody will accept. Now, you may get some weird discrepancies because of network latency issues and so on, but the idea is that after maybe a couple of rounds, when there are ties, they'll quickly resolve themselves as long as most of the nodes are behaving honestly and really stick to their implementation of the protocol. All right. Now, since Bitcoin miners are generating Bitcoins, I think there's an interesting question that comes up here, which is, how is the Bitcoin money supply controlled and how is it managed? And I'm going to talk about that concept in a subsequent video. In the last video, I talked about how Bitcoin transactions are really incorporated into a global and a publicly accessible ledger of sorts that we call the transaction blockchain. And this work is actually carried out by nodes in the Bitcoin network that are known as Bitcoin miners. And as a reward for all that effort, especially since some of the computational heavy lifting is done by these Bitcoin miners, they're basically awarded a certain number of Bitcoins for their efforts. And this happens by the miners effectively constructing what's called a Coinbase transaction and then basically assign themselves Bitcoins within that transaction. So in a sense then, and this is kind of intriguing, Bitcoins are effectively generated almost out of thin air during this process. And of course, if you see something like that, that might raise in your mind the question of whether there is ever an upper limit to the Bitcoin money supply. And fortunately, the answer, or maybe not so fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, the answer to that question is actually yes. And the Bitcoin system is actually designed so that there can be at most 21 million Bitcoins ever generated. Okay, so that's the maximum number of Bitcoins that can ever come up in the system. Beyond that point, no more new Bitcoins will ever be accepted or generated or allowed to be generated. And so as a result, nodes at that point, or from that point onward, once 21 million Bitcoins have been generated, nodes will no longer get a reward for augmenting the transaction blockchain. Okay, these Bitcoin miners who do all this effort are not going to get a guaranteed reward for doing that effort. And keep in mind that because every transaction in the Bitcoin system is public, and the nodes in the system actually know how many coins have been generated, it's possible to really enforce these limits on the total number of Bitcoins created. Now, there are actually 2 points I want to make regarding this particular limit. So first of all, even after it's reached, we're still going to need nodes to do what Bitcoin mining nodes do today. So that involves things like incorporating transactions into transaction blocks and incorporating these transaction blocks into transaction blockchains and so on and so forth. But if you think about it for a moment, once the 21 million coin limit is reached, these nodes don't get that automatic reward of Bitcoins for performing this extra effort. And now you might be wondering, well, what incentive is there for these nodes to engage in this additional effort? I mean, why are they doing this sort of thing if they're not going to get Bitcoins as a guarantee for doing that work? And really at this point, the hope is that when we reach the 21 million Bitcoin limit, or as we get closer and closer to it, that actually transaction fees will play a more prominent role in a node's decision to be a Bitcoin mining node. And in particular, the idea here is that we hope that transaction fees will be enough of an incentive, and more people will, in general, I think hopefully by this point, will be using Bitcoin. And so as a result, I think there is an expectation, or it's not unreasonable to think that as more and more people use Bitcoins, there will be more and more transactions, and as a result, more and more opportunity to make money off of transaction fees. And it turns out that in the context of Bitcoin mining, a lot of the heavy lifting is in this proof of work piece, not in being able to incorporate all these transactions into a transaction block. So even if there's a lot of transactions in the transaction block, it's not that much more effort for the miners to really incorporate those extra transactions. But if they're getting all these extra transaction fees, then that might be a good incentive for them. Okay? It's also worth noting that transaction fees are actually set by the payer in Bitcoin. Okay? The payer then is going to have the onus of setting the fee appropriately so that the nodes in the Bitcoin network are incentivized to add that payer's transactions to their transaction blocks. Alright? So hopefully that makes some sense. The second point I want to make regarding this limit of 21 million Bitcoins is that really Bitcoin does allow for fractional coins. And I haven't really talked much about that in this video, because I've really kind of implicitly talked only about the idea of coins being these whole entities, like Alice transferring 10 coins to Bob or 25 coins to Bob and so on. But it turns out you can actually have coins that are fractional. Okay? And in fact, the smallest possible unit in Bitcoin, it's a very small number, it's 0.000000001 Bitcoins. Okay? And this is 1/100 millionth of a Bitcoin. And this unit, by the way, just as an FYI, is known as a Satoshi. And this name actually comes from the name Satoshi Nakamoto. And Satoshi Nakamoto is the pseudonym of the inventor of Bitcoin. Nobody actually is sure that there is somebody actually named Satoshi Nakamoto, but as far as anybody can tell, the only person who's ever taken credit for the invention of Bitcoin is this Satoshi Nakamoto name, and it's unlikely there's actually a person behind that name, but it's more likely maybe some sort of a group or something of that nature. Okay? Now, aside from that, there are actually a couple of other additional controls that I want to mention. that are built into Bitcoin for keeping the growth of that money supply in check. So first of all, the reward provided to Bitcoin miners actually decreases over time. Okay, and if you were aware, when Bitcoin began, which was around January of 2009, at that time the reward for a Bitcoin miner to do their effort was 50 Bitcoins. Okay, now the way that the reward structure is set up is that every 210,000 blocks, so when you get to a 210,000 block period, okay, every time 210,000 new blocks are generated, the reward size actually gets cut in half, okay? And so what that means is that once 210,000 blocks are generated, the reward goes from 50 Bitcoins to 25 Bitcoins, and from 25 to 12.5, and so on and so forth, all right? Now, it does take approximately 4 years to generate 210,000 blocks, and I'll talk a little bit later about where this 4 years numbers come from. But as of right now, I'm recording this video, it's May 2013. The current reward is actually no longer 50 Bitcoins. The current reward now is actually 25 Bitcoins per mining operation. And it's going to go down in half in approximately 4 years. And that's just going to keep happening until the estimate is around the year 2140. So in the year 2140, we will expect that the entire Bitcoin supply will have been generated. Okay, so we're not gonna. It's unlikely we'll be generating Bitcoins after 2140. 2140 is the point at which all Bitcoins will have been generated. Okay, all Bitcoins will have been generated. Now, the last way to limit the generation of Bitcoins is to actually calibrate the difficulty of solving that proof of work protocol at a global level. Okay, and so I also want to point out that another functionality that Bitcoin has built into it is that for every 2016 blocks that are generated, the network basically estimates the time it took to generate those blocks. It looks at, how long did it take to generate the first of these blocks and how long did it take to generate the last of these blocks, and it measures that amount of time. Now, if that amount of time is let's say it's I don't know. Let's say it's something. It does take approximately 4 years to generate 210,000 blocks, and I'll talk a little bit later about where this 4 years numbers come from. But as of right now, I'm recording this video. It's May 2013. The current reward is actually no longer 50 Bitcoins. The current reward now is actually 25 Bitcoins per mining operation. And it's going to go down in half in approximately 4 years, and that's just going to keep happening until the estimate is around the year 2140. So in the year 2140, we will expect that the entire Bitcoin supply will have been generated. Okay, so we're not going to. It's unlikely we'll be generating Bitcoins after 2140. 2140 is the point at which all Bitcoins will have been generated. Okay? All Bitcoins will have been generated. Now, the last way to limit the generation of Bitcoins is to actually calibrate the difficulty of solving that proof of work protocol at a global level. Okay? And so I also want to point out that another functionality that Bitcoin has built into it is that for every 2016 blocks that are generated, the network basically estimates the time that it took to generate those blocks. How long did it take to generate the first of these blocks, and how long did it take to generate the last of these blocks, and it measures that amount of time. Now, if that amount of time is, let's say it's I don't know, let's say it's something that's significantly, bigger than 2 weeks. Okay, so if it's significantly bigger than 2 weeks, then the proof of work protocol will be simplified. Okay, but we're going to calibrate it so that it's easier to generate blocks. On the flip side, let's say it took a lot less than 2 weeks to generate these 2016 blocks. In that case, the proof of work will be again calibrated to be made more difficult. Okay, and the goal is that we want it to be the case that of 2016 blocks, we want it to be the case that it takes about 2 weeks to generate these blocks, about 14 days to generate 2016 blocks. Okay? And to get a better sense for why that number is the way it is, you could see that let's say it takes about 2 weeks to generate 2016 blocks. What that actually will imply is that it takes about 10 minutes before the proof of work is actually solved and a new transaction block rather is folded into the overall transaction blockchain. And you can actually work out that if it took 10 minutes to validate one new block in the system at a global level, and you multiply that by 6 to get the number of blocks generated per hour, so you get 6 blocks per hour, or really 6 new proofs of work per hour, which in turn would lead to 6 new transaction blocks per hour. You multiply that by 24 hours per day, and then you multiply that by 14 days, and you'll actually find that when you multiply these things together, you will get the number 2016. Okay, and so you can get a sense of where this number comes from. And I want to make one last final clarifying remark regarding this proof of work. Since solving the proof of work actually requires a Bitcoin mining node to come up with the proof string, which it currently does through some type of exhaustive search, as you increase the number of Bitcoin mining nodes on the network, then really all else being equal, the proof of work will be solved faster. Okay, and when I don't mean faster for a particular node, I mean faster at the level of the entire network. In other words, it'll take less time before at least one node comes up with a solution, because these nodes are all working on that same problem concurrently. And actually, on that note, I do also want to mention quickly maybe a more subtle point, which is that even though the different Bitcoin mining nodes are all validating either the exact same set of transactions or maybe a largely overlapping set of transactions, they actually are all solving entirely different proof of work protocols when they're doing this sort of thing. The reason for that is that Coinbase or generational transaction into the block that it's working on to award itself coins. Okay, and this generational or Coinbase transaction is actually unique to each node. So as a result, the challenge string for which, let's say, each Bitcoin mining node is seeking the corresponding proof of work, well, that challenge string will be different for each Bitcoin. Each Bitcoin mining node, rather. And so essentially what you have is that because you have a cryptographic hash function that's being used in the process, just this one difference, the fact that just this one piece is different, that actually completely randomizes the proof of work problem that results. And that makes it likely that across the entire network, the solutions are likely to be widely distributed, and we can expect that if we have enough nodes, one node will come up with a solution in about 10 minutes. Okay, at least one of the nodes will. They won't all do it, but at least one will, and once one node comes up with a solution, everyone else can kind of proceed from that point onward with the new chain. So as you can see, the Bitcoin protocol, takes a number of measures, implements a number of...
And after this will be the last part of the lecture, which also will be lasting just about 10 minutes.
Mechanisms to both limit the total number of Bitcoins as well as the rate at which these Bitcoins are ultimately generated. What I would like to do is describe an imaginary or fictitious Bitcoin transaction and then talk about how somebody might try to game or defraud the system, and why that's not only mathematically hard to do, but why there's actually an incentive, actually an economic incentive in the Bitcoin system for different people to behave honestly. So let's suppose that there is someone out there named Dan, and that Dan wants to order a pizza, maybe a cheese pizza from Pete's Pizza Shop. And let's say that Pete's Pizza Shop accepts Bitcoins as payment, and that it costs one Bitcoin for a pizza pie. And imagine that Dan received previously, let's say he received 5 Bitcoins from his cousin Carol. So maybe Carol, or with a label by C, gave to Dan 5 Bitcoins, which we can label as a B with a circle around it. And that he wanted to use one of these 5 Bitcoins to buy a pizza from Pete. And so what Dan's Bitcoin client will do is it will create a transaction record that includes information about how Dan got these Bitcoins. So in this case, it includes information about this transaction between Carol, who is marked by C, and Dan for 5 Bitcoins. And then it specifies that Dan wants to give one of these Bitcoins to Pete, and we'll label Pete by a P. And also that Dan is going to take the remaining 4 Bitcoins, that will be basically changed to himself. And the way that Bitcoin is built is that you have to actually specify the change. You need to have a way, whatever goes into the Bitcoin system has to kind of come out at the end. And so you can't have a transaction where the numbers don't add up. And so whatever is remaining is either change or part of it can be used as a transaction and so on. But for this example, to keep things simple, I'll assume there's no transaction fee in place. The transaction fee is just 0. And we'll focus only on the situation in which everything is being accounted for in the transaction. Now, this transaction record is going to be broadcast out to the entire Bitcoin world. And so in particular, Pete is going to receive a copy of this transaction. But in addition to Pete receiving it, so too will the other people on the Bitcoin system. And if you recall, there are these special nodes, these special entities or people in Bitcoin that are known as Bitcoin miners. And these Bitcoin miners are responsible for making sure that everything checks out in the transaction from a global perspective. What they do is they look at the full record of transactions, and this transaction record is public. It's known as the transaction blockchain, and I've kind of put a description of the transaction blockchain right here. And this transaction blockchain contains the history of every single transaction that's ever occurred within the Bitcoin system from the beginning of time, from the time of the first block, which is known in Bitcoin as the Genesis block. Okay, and everybody can verify that the details of any transaction if they want to, because that information is public. And in particular, what these Bitcoin miners will look at is they'll look at whether or not Dan previously received 5 Bitcoins from anybody else. In this particular case, it was his cousin Carol. Whether or not Dan has tried to spend those Bitcoins previously, and so on and so forth. And these Bitcoin miners are all collectively trying to take all these recent transactions that haven't yet been recorded, and that includes not only the transaction between Dan and Pete, but there will be other transactions floating out there that take place around the same time. And the Bitcoin miners will basically look at all of these different transactions at once, and they're going to basically try to figure out how to form a transaction block out of these transactions, and they want to add this transaction block to the end of the current transaction blockchain. Now, if you might recall from previous videos, that for a Bitcoin miner to add a transaction block to a transaction blockchain, they have to solve what's known as a proof of work puzzle. And the Bitcoin system is designed, or maybe calibrated is a better word, so that on average, one miner will solve a puzzle in about 10 minutes. Now, I think it's actually worth stressing here that it could take a long time for any one individual miner to solve the puzzle. It could even take maybe a year or even 2 years. But because there are so many of these miners working at the same time, one of them is bound to get lucky and solve the puzzle quickly. Now, each puzzle in the proof of work, each of these proof of work puzzles that is associated with a transaction block happens to have a difficulty score associated with it. And this difficulty basically represents how hard it was to solve that proof of work puzzle. And so imagine that there are some numbers, and we'll call these numbers, let's say we'll call them d sub n for the most recent difficulty score. There'll be d sub n minus 1. These are just numbers that somehow represent how hard it was to solve this proof of work. And when you look at an overall chain, what the Bitcoin system is interested in is it's interested in how hard was it to construct that entire chain. And the reason it's important for someone to understand how hard the entire chain was constructed is because this overall score for this chain, this difficulty score for the chain, is what's used by Pete or by other people who are receiving Bitcoins.
By the way, I'm going to pause this real quick, and right now they're deep into like the conversation about the blockchain, and there's also this cool book about this. I'll probably cover this in a significant more amount of details. And clearly, you know, this kind of stuff, it's kind of like deep mathematics, or like kind of being like some sort of lecture about mathematics. And sometimes it can be, most people will see it as like not being fun. And that's, what is the outcome of being there and listening to this. And if you're the whole time you're like thinking about why it's not valuable or why it's a waste of time to be listening to all this stuff, then maybe you don't find value, or the person doesn't find value into the things that they're being potentially forced to read. But this author right here, this was published in 2017. This book over here is called Mastering Bitcoin. It's published by O'Reilly, and the author's name is Andreas M. Antonopoulos. It's a very extensive, and it covers like really the Bitcoin quite well. So if anyone's ever interested in this, definitely take a look at it. There's also one, he published another book also about oh man, what's the other one? Oh, I didn't know he was from England. But yeah, so he's an English guy, and he also published one about the Internet of Money, Ethereum. And has he published anything recently? So he published one about Ethereum in 2018, and he published one, The Internet of Money, in 2019. So I'm most likely gonna have to do a bunch of reading, clearly. And yeah, just like I said, I'm gonna have to treat these like textbooks. And just maybe find also other ways to to get income. I mean, I feel like the whole idea behind Bitcoin is to not depend on it as like your primary source of income, but rather as a as one of the diversified source of either investment and potential, another potential source of income, or a tool for investing, like a specifically allocated budget in which you can use the Bitcoin to do some sort of investment. You create like a sort of budget that you invest into Bitcoin, and then you use those Bitcoins to do other investments and to make more money. I don't fully, understand how some people are making like all this money, but you know, whatever thought process I have, it is not like a police investigation. I'm not trying to investigate on Bitcoin and to try to find a reason to dismantle it. Like when I'm listening to hip hop music, I'm not trying to listen to it to dismantle it. I'm actually like trying to learn and to see if I can potentially find value into it, and into like all this other stuff. There's like potentially other things that might be very valuable, or that one could find value into it. And some of the stuff, clearly, as we saw in like these past what's it, like eight videos so far. Most of those videos are how could I say this? It, it's it all relies on providing a specific set of service and increasing value in the money that's being used, aka the Bitcoin. It provides a certain set of services, and it requires other people to be able to perform certain services to maintain the currency and to create some sort of value to it, and thus attach a certain value to it. So yeah, like I said, I think it's very interesting. There's many things that can be done. Unlike art, where art is can be it can be seen as extremely valuable by some people, and by some it can be seen as completely non-valuable. To some people, the Mona Lisa might be like one of the most prized possessions on the planet, and to some others, it might be like, yeah, it's just like a shitty painting. To some people, it might be like that. So, with that said, do I think that the Mona Lisa is a shitty painting? I sure don't think so. I don't want to get too off topic here, but what I was trying to talk about here was the value of things, how we assign value to different things, and I do believe that was definitely a part of the theme of the video. Assigning value, they specifically discussed it. Oh my god, look at my nose. You see, it's like super red right here. It's so dry. It's like literally my skin is like extremely irritated by the amount of tissues that I use. I think I almost used like a full. I opened this box like at the beginning of this video, and it's also almost empty. Atrocious. So I'm gonna finish this video. I gotta find a way to not just interact with these lectures as just lectures. So I'm probably going to let myself kind of process what had just occurred, and once I processed it, I'm going to maybe go back to certain things, go back to what was being discussed and see what I've learned, and then maybe go further into the topic. Maybe not by Khan Academy, but maybe by something else. Maybe I can try to find different resources on the topic. And I don't want to just do like a classroom kind of experience where I'm just like consuming things and it doesn't pertain to my my direct reality. I want to make sure that I'm learning something and I'm directly applying it, in like some minute form at first. And then once I have like a better understanding, I can try to, make it more significant. So yeah, that's what I want to be able to do. So I want to make sure that whatever I'm learning, I can, start to try to maybe do like a little bit of investing or understanding how it works uh, in this specific domain. So the reason why I was mentioning like the concept of like the reality of a university student is you have like all these different classes. So, today I sat in this class lecture for now about 2 hours and 34 minutes. It's quite common for some classes to go for 2 hours to 3 hours, some lectures. So it's not uncommon. I've totally done that, like, in the past. So, I gotta, this lecture is gonna end very shortly in like the next 10 minutes or so. And after that, I'm gonna try to do something else. Maybe I'll try to do some push-ups. I might still put it on like a YouTube. Like I said, my days right now, I'm not seeing like a lot of results. I haven't been seeing a lot of results, and it's really bothering me, to say the least. So, I've been doing push-ups and sit-ups. I was just making progress this summer, and I had finally gotten like 2,000 done in a day, and the only proof of that I have, and ironically, we're talking about proof of work in this, right? The only proof that I've had of me having done these push-ups is a piece of paper where I checked the checkbox. Now, that's really nice, right? But if somebody could be telling me like, "Oh, well, Quentin, I know that you said that you've done that, but and you wrote it down on a piece of paper, but wait, how can it be proven? Like, how can you prove to me that you've actually done these 2,000 push-ups?" And then they might look at me right now and be like, "Well, you don't look like you've done 2,000 push-ups. It doesn't look like you work out very often. It looks like, almost like you're getting fatter and all this stuff." So I just want to be able to do these, and not necessarily in the context of having like an alibi, because I don't have to run away from anything. I love jogging, so the act of jogging isn't like running away from something. It's just like, oh, I should try to stay warm, and I should try to have like some good physical exercise to remain fit, and it's really healthy. But I just I want to be able to prove to myself, that I've done that I can do certain things, and my life is kind of in shambles. I got to be really honest. It's in shambles. It's been in shambles, and I'm trying to find a way out of it. I don't want to commit crimes or to attack people in order to do so. Meaning, like, if somebody was to be like, "Oh, you need $20,000," yeah, yeah, okay, but you need to go harm this one person. I don't want to do that. So, I don't want to get money that way. I don't want to have to, sell poison to other people. I don't want to have to go sell crack to some people that are already in despair and suffering. I certainly don't want to go do that to wealthy people. I don't know if you're understanding, the drift of my thoughts here. I don't want to harm people. I don't want to poison people. So it's not in my intentions to harm other people, whether they're citizens or not. It's not something that pertains to my ethics, and I also don't necessarily want to have to go deep into personal ethics and then have to discuss how it would be my personal ethics to do so, and someone else is entitled to have their ethics, which might not be at all in coexistence with my own. that kind of debate kind of goes to like religious freedom and blah blah blah, so all this stuff. So I'm just gonna make sure that what I'm saying here is that I'm using the YouTube live stream as a tool for me to show what I'm doing in my daily life. I absolutely want to make like shorter videos, like the 15 minutes kind of video format. And it seems as though, like with TikTok happening and then YouTube Shorts happening, like the concept of having shorter videos and being able to be less like scrolling through the internet and watching like a bunch of videos, like having like extremely long content like this video of 2 hours or almost 3 hours is clearly not like ideal for most people, because most people don't have the time to put into 3 hours to watch a YouTube video. So it's kind of funny how I phrased that. There was like a select my selective hearing heard like the intonation at the end of the phrase there. So what I'm saying is, people might not necessarily have the time to watch YouTube videos that are lasting about 3 hours. With that said, uh, I just want to make sure that it's there, that I present my content, or the things that I do actually, more than content, the things that I do on YouTube Live. So if I'll be playing, video games, great. I'll put it on here as well. I love video games. Video games are awesome. It's just like an activity that I can do by myself. That's fun. I can have like a great afternoon. It's really cold out. I don't feel like going outside. I can do like an afternoon of video games. I could go to the ice skating rink, but am I going to go to the ice skating rink every day of the winter? Probably not. So with that said, I just want to make sure that I'm showing what I'm doing, showing that I'm improving over time, and also to keep in mind that I am not in competition with anyone. Maybe with myself, but it's not exactly competition. It would be more like I have a goal to get to a certain place, or a certain physical shape, or a certain number of books, and then I have to understand how I can personally improve to that without necessarily having to compete with someone else. Because I feel like a lot of competition kind of goes by demoralizing the other person in order to win, right? So you try to get the other person to no longer like what they're doing, and then the competition is out of the way, right? That's extremely unethical. But I feel like that's kind of how it works in many ways, right? You get someone else to not like what they're doing, which is the same thing as what you're doing. Like there's two pizza shop on the same like a street or something, and you try to put that other pizza place out of business. Well, I'm not trying to do any pizza. Ironically, there's like the pizza with one Bitcoin here on the TV screen, on the screen right here. So I am not trying to do that whatsoever. I'm also not trying to open up a pizza shop. So that or bakery, oh, there's another bakery right across the street. There's that one French family that's having a French bakery, and there's another French family that's also doing a French bakery. They're both on the same street, and they want to put each other out of business. It's not my vibe. It's not what I care to do here. So I'm trying to improve myself. I will share my improvements with everyone on here, and it's not something that is to be questioned. So that's the main thing. I don't want my journey to be questioned, as in like, oh, but have you been doing these push-ups? It doesn't seem like you've been doing anything, blah blah blah. No, I'm just gonna show it. I'm gonna make sure that you guys can see it, and if you don't want to see it, you don't have to. So you really don't have to watch what I'm doing, but if you do want to, I'll be there on YouTube, on my channel, the channel of Quentin Larcher. My name is Quentin Larcher in English, but my actual name is Quentin Larcher. So it'll be there. And with that said, let's not delay any further. Let's finish this lesson. Let's get this going. Let's hear about all the blockchain. And like I said, I'm gonna try to within the week do a little bit more research. Maybe spend some time getting through some chapters of different books, and I'll be putting it online or something. You know, I'm gonna have like study along life throughs where I'm just studying, and I'm also gonna have my push ups along videos where I'm just gonna be doing push ups, painting videos. I'm also gonna resume playing piano. I've gotten what's it called, Logic Pro X. Like when I got the laptop, I don't even know how long. I think that was last summer. And I got Logic Pro X for like $200, and I've been trying to record songs. I've done that before I came to this place, to this residence, to this house, when I was living with housemates around my own age, and I was literally just starting to mess around with like making music, and then all this happened, like shortly after me just trying to make some music, recording some songs, kind of being silly, just barely knowing how to play instruments, but just like trying to mess around with the software, downloading beats on YouTube, and then trying to like manage the skill of like writing a poetry and flowing on the melodies and stuff like that. So kind of just like messing around with it that way. And then all this stuff happened, and it feels kind of like I'm waking up like 5 years plus later. But I'd like to be able to be in control of my time and my space, like I said. So with that, I'm gonna take control back of my time and space here, readdress my attention to this video, and let's do this. Oh.
To figure out whether or not they trust that transaction. The more work that went into the overall chain, the more trust they'll have in that transaction. And the reason for that is that the way Bitcoin works is that if there was ever more than one transaction blockchain out there, let's say there was a bad user out there, or maybe somebody didn't receive a particular message in time, or whatever reason, if there's somehow more than one transaction blockchain out there, according to the Bitcoin protocol, everyone is just supposed to work off of the chain that had the most work put into it. So we ignore chains that have a lot less work and only consider the chain that had the most work put into it. And in the Bitcoin system, that particular chain is often referred to as the longest chain in the system. And this is actually kind of a confusing piece of terminology, because by longest here, we don't mean that this chain is long in any physical sense. We really just mean, and I'm going to put 3 equal bars to kind of say what it means. By the longest chain, we mean the chain that has the most work. And the way that the work is defined is that you look at all these different difficulty scores, and these are difficulty numbers, and you add them up, and that gives you a difficulty score for the entire chain. And now we're going to be interested in the chain that had the most work put into it, and we call that the longest chain. Now let's imagine that Dan is dishonest, and that after he eats the pizza, let's say Pete's convinced, and he gets his Bitcoin from Dan, he waits a bit, he sees that there's a long chain out there that contains a transaction, he sends the pizza over to Dan, Dan eats the pizza, and then decides that he doesn't want to behave honestly, and he wants to somehow cheat Pete, or he wants to defraud the system. And the way that Dan is going to try to defraud the system is by attempting to create another transaction in which he assigns the 5 Bitcoins he got from Carol to somebody else. And it could be, let's call this person Fred. And let's say Fred is basically, Fred could be Dan's alter ego, it could be a friend of Dan's. It doesn't matter who Fred is, because we know that Fred isn't the rightful owner of these Bitcoins. But what Dan is going to try to do is he's going to try to take those 5 Bitcoins that he got from Carol, and he's going to now try to take those 5 Bitcoins and assign them over to Fred. And we know that this is something that we don't want to allow, because that would mean that somehow Dan was able to spend these 5 Bitcoins twice over. He's effectively double spent those Bitcoins. And obviously one of these transactions should be considered fraudulent, and the other one should be allowed to go through. Now it's important to keep in mind that if Dan just tried to spend these same coins again without trying to cover his tracks or anything of that nature, then everybody out there would know that Dan is up to no good, because they can see from the existing longest transaction blockchain, namely this existing chain from the beginning, they can see that, hey, Dan already spent these coins before, he shouldn't be allowed to spend these coins again. And so what Dan has to do is actually, on his own, he has to create a different transaction blockchain that contains just this second bogus transaction in it, and this would be the transaction to Fred, and that would leave out the other transaction to Pete, and hope that everybody else will start to accept or believe this newer chain. And remember that since everyone in Bitcoin ultimately goes with the transaction blockchain that contains the most work, namely this longest chain that we talked about, Dan has a fighting chance. He has a hope, essentially, of being able to pull off this type of a fraudulent scheme. And the real question now is, how likely is it for Dan to succeed? So for Dan to be able to pull this off, he has to start off with the transaction blockchain that existed previously, and he has to try to add to that transaction blockchain a different transaction. So rather than having this previous transaction where he gave money to Pete, he's going to try to create a new transaction and add it to the transaction blockchain that contains this other fraudulent transaction between Dan and his friend Fred. Okay, so this is going to be the bad transaction between Dan and Fred will be in this new block. And in Bitcoin lingo, this idea is known as a fork in the chain. And all we mean by a fork is that somehow there is more than one version of history. Somebody tried to rewrite their tracks, and to revise history the way we know it. And what that really means is there's now somehow more than one version of what happened. So in this example, one branch in this fork is legitimate, the other branch is bogus. And the legitimate branch was the one, in our minds, where Dan paid his friend Pete, this vendor Pete, for a pizza, and the bogus one is this follow-on transaction where Dan attempted to pay his friend Fred with those same exact Bitcoins. But now remember that any transaction block that's added to this transaction block chain has to contain within it a proof of work puzzle, or a solution rather to a proof of work puzzle. Otherwise, no one will accept the chain. And so if Dan wants to cheat the system, he has to secretly solve a new proof of work puzzle himself. But the challenge for Dan is that he's starting off at a bit of a handicap, because there's already this longer chain out there that people have started accepting. And keep in mind that because this chain is out there, other nodes may have started to build on top of this chain. Every 10 minutes, somebody's adding to this chain on average. And so there's this longer transaction out there, and Dan wants to create his own fake chain, and so he has to create a chain. In order for that chain to be believable, it has to now be the longest chain out there, and he has to basically do all these proof of works to create a chain that is longer. And to come up with this longer chain on his own, Dan has to outrun the existing proof of work chain, and that means he has to solve not just typically one proof of work puzzle, but he may need to solve several proof of work puzzles to create another chain that he hopes will be longer than the chain that's out there. And if he can get the longest chain, he can get people to start using that chain instead, and that's a chain that he might want people to use because it contains this fake transaction, but it removes the previous transaction repeat. And to solve a proof of work, Dan has to basically take whatever computing power he has access to, and he has to start working on solving the proof of work puzzle. And there are no known shortcuts for solving these puzzles. If you recall from any of the proof of work videos, to succeed in a proof of work is kind of like winning a lottery. There are ways to do it, but it really depends on how much computing power you have. The more computing power you have access to, the more lottery tickets you have. And if somebody has even one lottery ticket, they do have a chance to win the lottery, but they are far less likely to succeed compared to somebody who has a lot of lottery tickets in hand. And even if you succeed once in winning the lottery with a small number of tickets, the likelihood of repeating that feat over and over again, several times in a row, becomes much smaller. But that's exactly what Dan has to do. He has to basically win this lottery multiple times until he has a bigger chain. And so the key metric here, the key thing you have to look for, is how much computing power Dan has versus how much computing power all the honest nodes in the system have together. And if it's the case that all the honest nodes, let's say we'll call it the honest computing power, and when I say honest computing power, I mean the total computing power for all the nodes who are honest, all the Bitcoin mining nodes who are honest in the network. If that total computing power that they have access to is greater than the power that Dan has access to, so Dan's computing power, then the Bitcoin system will be safe because it'll be hard for Dan to be able to create this fraudulent transaction chain because he won't be able to outrun the honest people. The honest people will win the lottery more frequently and they'll create a longer chain, and Dan's attempt is going to be very much an uphill battle. Now, it's theoretically possible that Dan could have access to a lot of computing power. Maybe he's very wealthy or he has a lot of resources. But he'll really need a lot to be able to do that, more than everyone else who's legitimate combined. So that's one aspect of why the transaction blockchain is secure, because it's unlikely for any one individual to have access to just that much computing power. And here I should point out that there is also another aspect to the security of Bitcoin. If Dan has access to that kind of computing power to solve these proof-of-work puzzles, then rather than trying to fight this uphill battle of forking the transaction blockchain and creating fake transactions and so on, Dan is probably much better off just using that computing power he has for legitimate Bitcoin mining himself. You might remember that Bitcoin miners who solve proof-of-work puzzles get both a reward for succeeding, they get some number of Bitcoins, and they also get a transaction fee for all the transactions in the block that they validated. So there's this economic incentive for Dan to behave honestly. And so maybe I should just recap in closing the video that the security of Bitcoin transactions comes from, first of all, this mathematical barrier that makes it hard for Dan to fork the transaction blockchain in a dishonest way, as well as an economic incentive for Dan to just act honestly and mine Bitcoins for himself.
Well, that was that.
Proof-of-work puzzles get a mathematical barrier that makes it hard for Dan to fork the transaction blockchain in a dishonest way.
That was intense. This is and was from 2013. I was living on my own. 2013. I think I had just moved to a house in New Brunswick, at Rutgers, New Brunswick. So this was some of my first experiences living with housemates, which I had not previously known, and just started to living on my own. I had a girlfriend at the time, and I was working in a restaurant as a busser, and I would pretty much work almost every day. So yeah, do I want to relive my life from 2013? No, no, I don't want a rerun of my life in 2013. But I think it gave me kind of like a taste for how I want life to be, and I'm not comparing myself to any other individuals. I don't know what other people were living in 2013. I've read so many things about the United Nations and all these poor countries and the starving kids in Haiti and the people that were affected by the hurricanes down south and all these different things. So I just want to focus on my life here. And I'm sure that if there's someone who's also studying this stuff and maybe ends up on my video, that person, meaning you viewer, might be also trying to focus on your life and learning some potential useful things. So yeah, with that said, this is the end of that stream. I am literally about to hit the 3 hour mark. This is about like the size of a long university lecture. Not by myself. I'm not a teacher, but by a professor, usually. So I'm gonna have to find like make myself like a sort of little schedule and yeah, kind of be able to teach myself different things, and maybe I'll become an even better student over time, and maybe I'll be even knowledgeable enough to maybe even teach certain things. I don't know. But it is not my goal to become a teacher or professor whatsoever. It's not what I wanted to do or what I want to do. So I'm going to be learning different things, and I want to make sure I complete my projects, hopefully with the deadlines that I seek to have them completed by. And I think that'll be kind of like little challenges, kind of like what I've been doing with the push-ups, kind of setting myself like higher goals and then kind of trying to stick to them and be able to complete them, feeling that sense of pride from the accomplishment that I set for myself, and then kind of trying to push myself further. That way there's a sense of growth, and I feel like time has passed by, and after that time has passed by, I've gotten better at the things that I was enjoying doing. especially when there are things that are, just activities that I do by myself that help me, or that pertain to my well-being, or my personal growth. And yeah, this is referring to studying, working, or yeah, any other topic that does not pertain to personal care. Uh, yeah. Anyhow, I am I'm gonna end this video now. Cheers. Happy to.